Do any members need to make a declaration of interest in connection with the bill? Yes, please.
Just to remind members, I'm a former police officer and current member of NARPO.
Anybody else? Thank you very much indeed. We're now going to hear oral evidence from the Union of Shop and Distributive and Allied Workers, the Co-op Group and the British Retail Consortium. We have until 2:40 for this panel. And starting from left to right from my end, Mr. Well, first, if you could introduce yourselves for the record.
Wynn from the British Retail Consortium.
Hello, I'm Chris Morris from USDAW.
Hi, I'm Paul Gerrard from the Cooperative Group.
Thank you all very much indeed. Harry Cross. Have I gone?
As you know, got a lot of history with this bill. Very familiar faces to me. I'm obviously delighted to see the assault on the retail worker offence come forward. But what more do you think we can be doing in that space to protect retail workers? And do you have any thoughts on the the food and drink wholesale UK suggestion that we should have included or a similar offence for wholesale workers?
USDAW has membership within the wholesale sector. We've got recognition agreements in Bhaker, Macro and Best Way, and I think there is scope. You do initially think that a wholesale, you've got to be registered to attend the wholesale, you've got to have a card so that the wholesale will know who you are, and that would restrict the likelihood of threats, abuse and violence against wholesale workers. But what we do find quite commonly is that there still are issues in there, and that people are still abusive towards those workers, and those workers still have to sort of check ID and things, sort of enforce certain parts of the law. And and while those workers are doing those sorts of responsibility, we would think that there is a case for those to be covered by these provisions, extending the scope of the provision to include wholesale as much as retail.
Any more on?
So we're very supportive of the bill, as you would expect. Retail crime over the last few years has risen significantly. If I look at the Co-op Group, we have seen a 44% rise in all forms of crime, of retail crime. We've seen a 43% rise in threats and abuse, and we've seen a 24% rise in violence. I think the offence is welcome because we've seen it work in Scotland. In Scotland, when the police attend, you get a 60% charge rate, whereas in England and Wales it's currently a 10% charge rate, so I think we know it works. I think the two things I would say is, speaking as a former law enforcement officer, the statute is really important, but it's got to be implemented, and it's got to be used, and I very much welcome the work that Amanda Blakeman has done, Chief Constable in North Wales, because we have seen improved police response. I think the second point I would make is that it's probably not about the bill, but it's about the broader issue about tackling retail crime, is that 70% of retail crime and much of the violence is by a relatively small number of prolific offenders. When you look at those prolific offenders, there is very often vulnerabilities in there. It could be substance abuse, it could be gangs, etc. And therefore, this kind of, if this clause becomes law and those individuals are then in front of the courts, what the courts do needs to be the thing that stops the behaviour, and it will sometimes be a custodial sentence. I was talking to one of my colleagues who had their leg broken for being in the wrong place when a thief was leaving the store, or another colleague just last Saturday who had 7 stitches on their head because they wouldn't give someone change that they weren't entitled to for an ice cream. Okay, so I think we need to make sure that the criminal justice system takes the right action to stop the behaviour. So it could be a custodial sentence, absolutely, but it could be rehabilitation orders, it could be restorative justice, community orders, whatever stops the behaviour. I think that's the key for me. This piece of legislation is great because it will get them in the criminal justice system quicker and easier, but we've got to make sure we take the right action at that point.
Thank you.
Chairman, Paul is one of my members, so to some extent I defer to him. But yes, we're totally supportive of the bill, the retail elements of the bill, and we look forward to it being enacted. You asked about expanding it to include wholesale. all I can say is, obviously, I'm here to promote the interests of retailers and not to prevent others who need protection also having some sort of protection. The only thing I'd say to that is that, first of all, and wholesale is, as Chris has said, in a similar situation in many ways, but all I'd say is that retailers, the one unique thing about them is they have to enforce age-restricted sales, and in some ways they're enforcing the law themselves, and therefore they're in a slightly different position to many others, and they often, these violent offences occur in the context of either refusing a sale or asking for ID and somebody not having it. But the only other thing I'd want to, two other things. First of all, if you're going to extend it, we would like to see it extended to drivers, making sure that people who deliver to people's homes from supermarkets and other things, other places, are also protected. That's quite a strong desire for that. But also, it's important that what happens here is that the statistics are gathered for retail crime. And one of the things this offence does is to make sure that we have perhaps better statistics at the official level. So it's important that we don't extend it so far or in such a way that we don't still get the statistics for the retail element. So that's one of the key pluses, if you like, of the offence. Because statistics are somewhat debated, put it that way, sometimes between official ones and the ones we gather.
As part of the Criminal Justice Bill, there was obviously a proposal that anybody responsible for 3 incidents of assault on a retail worker or shoplifting should be mandatory subjected to a curfew, a tag or a ban. Do we think there's a role for curfews, tags and ban in dealing with this problem?
As I said before, I think...
Mr. Gerrard?
As I said before, I think whatever intervention will stop the behaviour is important. I think those things that you just described could easily do so. I think a custodial sentence could do so. But I also think things like rehabilitation, etc. I mean, over the last couple of years, we've worked with specific partnerships with 19 different police forces. 700 offenders are managed. Less than 7% of those received a rehabilitation order. You only have to speak to any retailer who will tell you substance abuse is a real driver of much of this behaviour. It cannot be right that only 7% are getting rehab orders because you're not tackling the root cause. So those things you describe, absolutely. But I think there's a range of it's what would stop the reoffending behaviour. Which could be custodial, it could be rehab, it could be curfew, it could be tax.
That's
I think there's always two sides to look at it, and from the retail worker's perspective, when someone's been into the store and committed serious violence or proposed significant threats to retail workers, that retail worker still has to go back to that same place of work, still has to carry on the same task, and will be constantly worried that that incident could happen again. And where there are significant incidents and issues of a ban or a curfew and those sorts of things may well be appropriate in certain situations to ensure that the retail worker is protected and to stop sort of mental health impacts from the initial incident.
Yeah, so earlier we heard some legal opinions on the fact that moving those offences under £200 into tribal either way could actually lead to significant delays. And obviously if these people are prolific offenders coming time and time again, one of the suggestions earlier was that speedy justice is effective justice. Do you think it's important that justice is dealt with speedily in these cases? And do you think that should play a part in our decision making on this situation?
Wynn?
Yes, I think that is important because if you don't, then the people who might give evidence in the trial or to the court may well have moved on, may no longer recall the offence, may no longer work indeed in the same retailer, especially when it's in the violence sector, if you like, violence issue rather. So that speedy and swift justice is worthwhile, I think, and makes the point. And in terms of the sentences and types of sentences, I think when we're in the EU, the Commission always used to say in its directives, it must be dissuasive, and I think that's a good term, that the penalties must be dissuasive. and exactly what the range should be is, I think, probably for government and people to place it into the context of other offences and all that sort of thing, and what and evidence of what works best.
Otherwise, happy? Yeah.
Diana Johnson, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving evidence today. I just wanted to ask you, in terms of the new provision around assaulting a retail worker, could each of you just say what your feeling is about how that will make shop workers, retail workers feel? Will they feel reassured that there will be action if they are assaulted in the workplace?
Morris?
Yeah, me first. I think from the evidence that we've got in Scotland of similar provisions and the feeling of that from the members that we've received, they do feel more assured on that basis, that they know there is a specific offence there to protect them. And as was mentioned before, they're quite often involved in law enforcement, and they feel that they should have the right of law enforcement there. But I think it also sends a slightly broader message than that. It sends a message to perpetrators, and we were pleased that Police Scotland did a significant amount of work before the Scottish provisions came into force to educate the police force on the provisions and where they could be used. And then the use of those provisions, as Paul was saying, we've seen a drop in violence, and it's the use of the police using those provisions that has helped to drop that violence amongst perpetrators. And then when it gets to the courts and judiciary, the provision also sends a clear message that this is a significant issue for those to deal with as well. So I think it helps retail workers, but it helps right along the chain of making sure that these issues are tackled and dealt with.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I wouldn't underestimate how retail workers have over the last 10, 12 years felt completely abandoned by law enforcement and, with the greatest respect, this place at times. When you are, and this is a couple of years old because I think the police have made great strides in the last 15 months, and I should say that. But when you are ringing to report an armed robbery, three men, masked men with machetes, and you are told to ring the non-emergency line, that tells you as a shop worker how you feel. I was with a colleague this morning, one of our nicer partners, Ben from Freshfields in Croydon, and he was saying to me, he, as the owner of 3 small shops, and his staff know about this provision and are genuinely pleased that someone is looking out for them. So I would not underestimate the impact that this will have. And talking to my own, we have 55,000 colleagues in the co-op. Absolutely, my colleagues know about this and welcome it because they feel, alongside the improved police response that we are beginning to see, that someone other than the co-op and the families care about what happens to them at work.
Wynn, do you wish to comment?
Yeah, Chairman, I think it sends a message to potential offenders and indeed to retail workers. And I think basically they can see it as part of a package. There's these proposals, the government's action on neighbourhood policing with a specific mention of taking action on retail crime in that. There's the Retail Crime Action Plan from the National Police Chiefs Council with its messages or its requirements, its desire to have better police attendance on violent crimes or where the person is detained and there's clear evidence. And lastly, it's part of a package with, as I mentioned before, leading to better and improved statistics so that everyone can feel more confident that the police will attend, that something will happen to those who commit these offences.
Can I just ask as well about the presumption with an assault on a retail worker that a criminal behaviour order will be attached? I know we've been talking about some of the measures that we think are important to put alongside a conviction, but do you support a criminal behaviour order which could in effect ban the individual from attending a particular area or a particular shop? Would that be also helpful in reassuring shop workers in particular?
Well, if I might, Mr. Chairman, the retailers themselves in our latest survey, which was up to, I think, August or September last year, said they issued themselves 400,000 banning orders in a civil sense, you know, banning people in a civil sense. So I think that people do think that banning orders, and indeed I know that's not the total part of the CBO, but I think that as a first offence, it's better than doing nothing or telling them to go and do community service or discharge or whatever it may be. It's something specific, and of course if they breach that, then more serious things can follow. So I think, you know, a proportionate approach is probably quite sensible, and that's the first option, if you like, and then unlimited fines and 6 months of prison sentences can follow. So yes, I think they're useful.
Any others? Yes, Gerrard.
The cooperative community-based retailers win every cooperative in the country. Many of my colleagues who are attacked or abused or threatened will know the people because they are from the same communities. Therefore, a CBO is a really powerful way to protect them, and not only to protect them, to be seen to protect them, because it stops those people coming in. The number of times over the last 8 or 9 years that we've campaigned on this issue, that colleagues have said to me, even when the police come, and as I said, that has changed significantly over the last 15 months, even when the police come, they'll be back the next day. Whereas that CBO gives my colleagues that sense of there is a legal protection to keep them away from us. And I think that is a very powerful signal, as well as practically keeping colleagues safe and shops safe.
One small question. I just want to ask about the majority of shop theft cases are heard in the magistrates' court. And is it your understanding they will continue to be heard in the magistrates' court?
I believe so, yes. I would expect it to continue to be heard there, because that's where people can get the swiftest justice, if you like. We know the other courts are very full and very full up with cases, and there are delays to people, as we mentioned earlier. So that would be the understanding, I think.
Thank you. Liberal Democrats, Luke Taylor.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for coming along. You'll have to forgive me as I try and kind of wiggle around here a little bit. Looking at clause 14, it talks about the assault of a retail worker, and it goes on to define the place of work of the retail worker. Something that you mentioned, Mr. Wynn, got me quite interested in talking about delivery drivers. And it does talk about premises includes a vehicle, a food truck. I'm thinking about workers that might be, for example, a washing machine installation engineer working for Currys, somebody like that. Do you think this bill protects somebody like that working for a retail firm but actually in somebody's home, and whether that might be something that you identify as an issue that potentially could be covered by this bill, or that you would look to be covered by a bill like this?
Could I sort of link that question back to CBOs from a couple of questions ago? But I think there is a clear issue there. You know, the various parts of the home delivery sector, home delivery from retail, require the worker to go into people's homes, and that's, you know, Sainsbury's, Tesco, Ocado home delivery. There's an offer to almost put it in the fridge for people, and then you've got sort of those two-man delivery, a typical two-man delivery operation, sort of washing machines and beds, and there's a significant issue certainly on the grocery side. Where those delivery drivers are also having to make age verification checks when sort of alcohol or age-restricted products are being delivered, and they're having to say that someone can't have them. You're almost in the door with those products, and you've got to say, oh, sorry, the ID's not here, I've got to take them away, which can cause issues of violence, threats and abuse, and then also the way that the systems operate, the substitutions as well. And you can be having sort of conversations about those substitutions, which can raise sort of frustration levels of customers. So we would want to try and see that those aspects where people are going into people's homes or delivering to people's homes, it's not necessarily questioning the threshold, are covered as well. And I think part of the reason to sort of link back to CBOs and why we'd want it covered is that there is, you know, the link in here to CBOs is really good. Can help if one at Sainsbury's as a random example, delivery driver goes into someone's home and receives a significant threat, then Sainsbury's can take the decision to take the address off the customer list, but the other companies wouldn't know if there's a CVO in place, and the ban could be put on that because that significant threat or instance of violence is so great that there is a ban from requiring other retail, what we see as retail workers, those delivery drivers going into the store. So I think they're areas that we're keen to continue to engage with government on to make sure that the bill's as effective as we believe it can be possible.
Thank you.
My understanding is, and I'm happy to be corrected, that the bill does not cover delivery drivers or people other than any. It's people working basically in a retail store, and the reference to a vehicle isn't meant to be a delivery driver or a delivery van or something like that. We do note that in the Scottish Act it does extend to Scottish Act is different, but it does extend to delivery drivers and makes that explicit. We do think that that would be sensible and useful, and there are concerns about delivery drivers. We understand the difficulty of saying, well, where do you draw the line? Because you mentioned people going into people's homes. Well, plumbers do, and other people go into people's homes. So just where do you draw that line? And if you dissipate it too much, it undermines the value of the whole thing. But I think that certainly we don't not support others being protected, but we certainly support the classic delivery driver of home produce from supermarkets being included. It's included in the Scottish Act, so perhaps it can also be included in this one, unless the Scottish draftsman got it wrong.
Burton Sampson.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think it's good when we look at how we're moving forward, where we look at where we come from. So I think it was the coalition government, they inserted Section 176 of the Anti-Social Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act, which basically provided that low-value shop theft, i.e. values of shop theft under £200, would be a summary-only offence, and we know where that's taken us to, that we have little, if any, police attendance at those sorts of offences. So what impact has that had on you and your members, and does the repealing of that £200 threshold give you better confidence that police will prioritise attendance at those type of thefts moving forward?
Thank you, Chair. That provision undoubtedly was gamed by individuals engaged in retail crime. They knew what the limit was. I also think it sent a very strong message to the police that that isn't something that they should be focused on. And in truth, if you go into a co-op store and steal £200 worth of £199 worth of product, you've still got a lot of product, right? And you're still probably going to be involved in there'll be flashpoints around that, be it threats, abuse, or violence. So I think it undoubtedly has had an impact. I also think that repealing it, combined with the fact that the police now recognise the importance of tackling retail crime, and they do. One of the data points that we have used consistently is how often do the police turn up when we've detained an offender. Now we will if someone has got 10 bottles of wine, 12 bottles of wine that they're trying to steal, that's less than 200 quid, right? And we detained that offender. The police weren't turning up 8 times out of 10. The police are now turning up 6 or 7 times out of 10. So if you combine the police response with a genuine ability for them to understand when they need to engage, I think it makes a massive difference. Because wherever you draw a line, or whatever becomes the norm, individuals involved in this criminality will gain it. I'll give you another example. The police are now turning up much more consistently on violence, right? Okay, and therefore we've seen a little dip on violence levels because some people are understanding that they might not need, if they engage in violence, they might get a problem, and this bill will make that a real issue. So they will gain whatever the line is. So taking away that line makes it much more effective for the police to be able to do their job.
I think I completely agree with Paul. Our members have seen that the system has been gained at a £200 threshold, and I remember working in stores, some of them are not necessarily hugely profitable, and they get to the point where they're no longer financially viable as a result of theft that goes out of the door. And another thing that we see is that staff are reduced in stores because there's not enough money, so then the whole store becomes more vulnerable to attack. So taking it away, and as Paul said, taking that route away will help to ensure that stores are safer and that the system isn't gained as much as it currently is.
Yes, so it's certainly been gained. Last year, in our survey, 20 million incidents. That's 55,000 a day of shoplifting. Just goes to show, I think, that it's the highest ever. And I think that shows that there are people who we know from what people tell us that there are incidents of where somebody goes in and they go back to the same store time after time and walk off with £190 worth of goods because they know that nothing will be picked up. We do realise, of course, that it's important that retailers report the crime, that or the incident, and it's important too that they have the evidence that the police can use to prosecute, because without the evidence, and we had a meeting just the other day with the police for members, and they emphasised that really they can't put resources into turning up to incidents where there's no evidence, where there's no CCTV of it perhaps, and indeed where the perpetrator has already left the scene and that sort of thing. So it's incumbent too, we recognise, on retailers to do their part and the police to do their part.
Thank you. I don't think we're going to have time to allow every panel member to answer every question, so if members could be kind enough to try and direct their questions, that would probably be helpful for everybody. Harriet Cross.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger. I'd just like to ask a bit more about anything in the Scottish Act. We've mentioned that delivery drivers are included. Is there anything else in the Scottish equivalent which you think is working particularly well that's missing from this Act and would be a good thing about this if it was replicated?
Was that to me?
Or any.
The other thing in the Scottish Act that's different is abuse is covered. It's not clear whether that's actively been used. I believe it has a bit, but our concern is really to focus on delivery drivers, because abuse is very difficult to prove and to get the level right, other than in the protected characteristics, of course, and there are special laws on that, as we all know.
I think there's one more thing within the Scottish Act is a aggravating factor. So when when an incident happens as a result of a retail worker enforcing the law, then that would be treated as an aggravating factor when it comes to sentencing, which gives retail workers additional protections for enforcing the law, which is important. And I think the abuse area there have been if you look at the figures, I just can't find them on my piece of paper now, but there is significant evidence that abuse and threats have been, incidents have been recorded and reported under the Scottish Act as well, so it would be good to get those covered at the same time.
Thank you.
David Taylor.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger. I direct my question to Paul, and thanks for coming in. I just want to pick up on what Christopher said about the impact that shoplifting has had and why removing this £200 is so important. To put it into context, I'm grateful for the visit that the Cooperative enabled me and my constituency to go and see a co-op store where I was taken to a room at the back where I was shown CD after CD of footage of regular shoplifting by the same offenders, and yet very little had been done about it. What impact has that had on your profits over the years, and also as well on your staff's morale?
So I'll do the second bit first because I think it's... Thank you. I'll do the second bit first because I think it's most important. The Retail Trust published some data not long ago that said 37% of people in retail are looking to leave retail because of violence and threats of abuse. 49% of retail workers, according to the Retail Trust, are scared going to work, and 90%, I think, USDAW's figures and ACS and Retail Trust, 90% have been abused. The impact on colleagues is enormous. If they are not themselves being attacked, they are seeing their colleagues attacked. They are seeing what happens, and they are seeing or have seen a lack of a police response. And also, and I will just say this, a colleague of mine who was barged out of the way by a shoplifter last weekend has broken her femur. Her husband had to come and collect her. He didn't wish her off to work that morning thinking he's going to have to collect her from to take to the hospital to have an operation on a broken femur. So the impact on colleagues is huge, and I don't think we should underestimate that. Financially for the co-op, last year it was about £75 million in cost in terms of product, plus we have spent for about the last 6 years £40 million, which we spend 3 times the sector average, £40 million on preventative measures, guarding IT. So financially it is a significant hit, and absolutely, as Chris said, we haven't done it yet. I know some retailers have. There are some stores that are right on the edge of being viable. That's a huge impact on us, but also for our colleagues. Our colleagues do not go to work. They go to work to serve the communities they very often live in. They don't go to work to get abuse, threats and worse.
Just trying to see if we can find a shilling for the meter. Mr. Wynn.
I don't have much to add to. I think Paul's said all that needs saying. That not only shop workers see the violence, but also the customers, and they are affected also. And don't expect to go and watch and see violence in their store, and abuse too, of course. So yeah, I think Paul's described it very well.
Thank you, Chair. Directed any one of you on the panel, if I could take you back to an area where I think you all share the same opinion, was that Clause 16, theft from a shop should be triable by either way, regardless of the value of goods, so below £200. And I think the suggestion is that the police don't seem to be as responsive or as interested if it's a summary-only offence. But I would perhaps suggest that's a policing issue, and that the unintended consequence of removing this threshold could be you're putting low-value offences into potentially the Crown Court system, which is more expensive with a longer backlog, then you might find the system is gained another way. So just inviting an opinion perhaps that police policy issue might be the problem, where they respond, because a summary-only offence is still a crime.
Yeah, not necessarily my speciality, but I think I'd probably leave it to someone else. Actually, it's not my speciality. I think Paul's more on this area.
So I'd a couple of points, and I do understand the point you're making. Less than £200 is still a significant sum of money, yeah, and sorry, a significant sum of product. Okay, if you get, as I said, you could get 20 bottles of wine, or you could get the entire meat section. So I wouldn't underplay it. But the second thing is, I think there is something here about making it clear that walking into stores to take whatever you want isn't acceptable. Now that is a message that this place should send. Okay, and secondly, helping the police understand that is really important. Now, how the criminal justice system then handles that, I take your point absolutely, but it is not okay for someone to walk in, make some threats, steal whatever they want, and walk out again. And at the minute, because the police do not look in general at things under £200 unless there's aggravating factors like violence, actually, that's what happens.
Just to clarify, I agree with you on that point. I think my problem is this idea that a summary-only offence is not really an offence at all, so the police don't need to attend. I think we're all agreed on that. It's plainly an offence. I worry that pushing things into the Crown Court creates a whole load of other problems. Thank you.
So where do you want to comment?
Not specifically. I think that it's just an attitude that's grown up, I suspect. Police have to make judgments as to whether they go or not, and with limited resources, and they've come to the conclusion if it's under £200, clearly, in their view, Parliament didn't mean them to worry too much, and that was perhaps grown up as a culture, if you like, and this will help stop that, hopefully, because it could be a two-way offence, and they'll make a difference.
Thank you, Mr. Gerrard, Mr. Morris, Mr. Wynn. We're indebted to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. We're a couple of minutes early, but I'm going to try and use that couple of minutes to see if we can sort out the lighting, and I do apologise. Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon. I apologise in advance for the fact that we have some interesting lighting effects. We're going to work through it, one way or the other. So we're now going to hear oral evidence from the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales and the Suzy Lamplugh Trust. And we have until 3:10 for this panel. Could the witnesses please identify themselves for the record?
I'm Baroness Newlove, the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales.
I'm Suky, Bhaker, Chief Executive of the Suzy Lamplugh Trust.
Thank you very much indeed. Leading for the opposition.
Having read the bill, is there anything that concerns you, anything you think we should be doing a bit more of, or any things that you'd like to see in the bill that aren't in the bill?
Shall I go first? Well, I've only got 15 minutes, so I won't drag on with the committee. Well, I welcome what's in the bill. There is a lot. There is some issues around mandatory reporting, police vetting, and also the ASB case review, I would say.
Suzy Lamplugh Trust specialises in stalking and harassment, so talking to the specific introduction of the new clauses around stalking, we welcome the introduction of statutory guidance, additional protection for victims in terms of the right to know, and the additional measures around stalking protection orders. But there are some detail that we think needs to be caveated within those clauses.
Yeah. Do stronger provisions need to be introduced to ensure that police and victims are informed when a sex offender changes their name?
Yes. I've looked at what is going on in the bill, and it's something I've worked on for quite a while with Safeguarding Alliance, and I know Sarah Champion MP has been involved when we were working on the Victims and Prisoners Act. And I still have a problem because it does say, the new clause does say that the offender or who comes out must inform the police. For me, it's about, and it's always been about trust. I just think it's wrong that we rely on the offender to inform the police and inform the probation. That's the whole point of what's gone wrong in the first place, is that to agree a prisoner can change their name in prison was utterly unbelievable. And secondly, to rely on trust. for that offender to notify the agencies. It still worries me that it's not the other way around.
And you said you had concerns particularly around antisocial behaviour. Would you just give us a bit more on that?
Yeah, sorry, your audio's not very good. Antisocial behaviour is, as everybody knows, is something I really champion. I've just got an issue with the ASB case review, which I welcome what's in there, but the actual small print, shall we say, is that I know you're going to create a police body review for the ASB case review, but I still think there needs to be more support as you go through it. And also the communication is a huge issue for victims. And while I say I welcome this body to do it, I still think they need we call it a single point of contact, a SPOC, which sounds like something from Star Trek. So I call an advocate, whatever you want, a victim's advocate, to support them right through, because this, while they're waiting for all these procedures to go through, they're still having the impact of the antisocial behaviour while they're waiting for it. And also to ensure that they get that one-to-one contact helps them to understand the process. Also having that, what I do welcome is having that response. They can have that, they don't like the response of where the process has gone, and they can appeal it. But in all of that, they do need support right the way through.
Yeah. Bhaker, you wish to comment?
I'll probably defer to Baroness Newlove on issues relating to anything that's not stalking.
Just want to make sure that there isn't something you want to add. Thank you. Dame Diana Johnson, please.
Thank you, Baroness Newlove, for the report that you did. I think it was at the end of last year, The Living a Nightmare. And in there you particularly talked about people who were suffering from ASB and the support they needed and the review process. Mm-hmm. And you've already touched on this a little bit, but I just would welcome your views on the role that the PCC, the Police and Crime Commissioner, will play. What do you think about that? Do you think that's the right thing to do? Do you welcome that?
Yes, I do welcome the PCC has been involved, and I do welcome what's gone on. And I think that statutory duty is important. And also they've got a duty to consult with the Victims Commissioner, which that's important as well. But in all of these stages, instead of adding another layer, I want to make sure that the communication is right, that they're informed about this process. And also to look at, which I did try to put in the Victims and Prisoners Act, was that we'd have an independent chair, somebody who's accredited, somebody who knows, because it still can feel very much that it's marking their own homework, because you've got the local police review and you've got the PCC. It very much feels that's why that the victim has to wait for them to make the decisions. Yes, we have a review process, we have an appeal process, but it's all that communication, how it feels to them. And of course, how long will this take? And I do worry about that for the victim. And that's why I keep asking for support, as I did in the Victims and Prisoners Act. It's very important that, especially victims of antisocial behaviour that have it on constantly, their mental health and physical health will be really, really in a bad way if we don't give them the support that they truly need, which then moves me on to having them in the Victims Code, which, if it comes under the criminal threshold, this is the bit that we used to argue in the Victims and Prisoners Act, actually they should get the support they need, because it shouldn't have to wait. I would imagine they could see what's happening on the decline of it. And as I've said previously, we're not learning from Fiona Pilkington, David Askew and my own husband's case that what they're going through on a daily basis shouldn't be acceptable to reach a threshold. They should be using their common sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Luke Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've had a lot of work done into stalking legislation in my constituency due to some casework that we've received. And I'd very much agree with the statement here that the Suzy Lamplugh Trust had previously identified systemic issues with the police response to stalking. Can you just talk through what extent you think the measures in this bill will address that, and potentially again this becomes a little bit open-ended, so I apologise, what you think the bill could go further in that respect to try to improve the responses of the police, my experiences in London, but around the country, and try and stop these hideous crimes from occurring in the first place.
Yes, thank you. So you may be aware that the National Stalking Consortium, on behalf of the National Stalking Consortium, the Suzy Lamplugh Trust submitted a super complaint, of which the recommendations came out late last year. And the super complaint committee found that there was significant evidence of police failings in identifying and evidencing stalking. In fact, in less than 2% of reported cases are reaching any level of conviction. We're also finding significant difficulties when it's coming to the judiciary and magistrates and understanding among prosecutors about what constitutes stalking, leading to mischarges and the dismissal of stalking cases. To that, in Clause 71, and the provision of statutory guidance would go some way in providing a single authority, I guess, on the law and encouraging a consistent understanding of stalking across the criminal justice system. At the moment, guidance is inconsistent. In fact, it's conflicting. We have CCB guidance, which places a different emphasis to guidance that the CPS have produced on stalking. It's really important that that is a multi-agency statutory guidance that is produced. As I mentioned, the super complaint made reference to magistrates and judges specifically not understanding the presentation of psychological harm that victims experience. And again, we hope that the statutory guidance might go some way in addressing this. There's been significant evidence about the lack of use of stalking protection orders, and we would hope again that this guidance would bring together the Stalking Protection Act and guidance that currently exists under that. It's really important that any statutory guidance is done in consultation with specialists across the sector, and obviously training needs to be pivotal to underpinning that. In terms of addressing some of those systemic issues, risk management is central. So Clause 72, we know from the victims we support would go some way in managing that risk and be critical. At the moment, victims do not have the right to know, particularly when they're being stalked by a stranger stalker. That information sometimes is possessed by police or other agencies, and they're not able to obtain that. You might be familiar, for example, with the case of Nicola Thorpe, the broadcaster and actor who campaigned quite heavily on this issue. Her stalker was a stranger stalker. He made comments of the fact that he was sitting so close to her on the tube, he could touch her, and she didn't know who her stalker was. Everybody became her stalker. Given the fact that we know that protective orders aren't used enough, it's often left down to the victim to protect themselves. And without the identity of that perpetrator, that becomes really, really difficult. We know that stalkers will contact multiple people around the victim, often up to 21 family members on average, friends and family, colleagues. Again, if we don't know who the perpetrator is, how can those protections be put in place? We also know that in recent research, actually 90% of all femicides had stalking in the antecedent history. So when we're looking at the prevalence in terms of risk, there is really no question that those safety mechanisms need to be put in place. In terms of where can we go further, the Stalking Protection Order and changes in terms of the court being able to issue those on acquittal and conviction is certainly something that we would support, because we know that we see significant challenges, as I said, in obtaining those. Just as a measure, in the year ending March 23, 531 applications were made for stalking protection orders. That's against over 116,000 stalking offences being recorded. So actually we're seeing less than 1% of all stalking offences receiving stalking protection orders.
Can I just, so on that, that's an astonishingly low figure.
Yeah, be playing beat the clock for our cap. But it's all right.
And it kind of leads into a bit of a question on how they're working at the moment. You're welcoming extending it. Does that suggest that you think they're working quite well at the moment, where they are applied in these very small number of cases?
I think the challenge is we see pockets of really good practice, and we have a number of specialist sites that have developed specialist programs across the UK, and where we've had that embedded training and the full extent of the stalking protection order utilised. So there are positive obligations attached to stalking protection orders. That's what makes them unique. So it doesn't just prohibit, but it can compel a perpetrator to attend something like a programme. Often those elements aren't being used. We're not seeing things like the duration of stalking protection orders being utilised, often quite short in length, which means victims are having to go back to court to apply for those again. We're seeing barriers in understanding, so even though police might make applications, legal services might fall down in terms of their understanding and pushing that application going forward. So for us, I think there always needs to be a presumption that a stalking protection order should always be in place, and if not, why not? That needs to be evidenced. So certainly we would support that extension, but I think we need to remember that stalking protection orders were brought in as a preventative measure, as an early intervention tool at the beginning of an investigation to offer victims protection whilst that investigation is ongoing. So what we don't want to do is leave victims unprotected for that duration and bring them in at the latter end. There is obviously a value in that, but we want to make sure that they're protected through that duration.
Thank you. I'm going to have to ask for concise answers, I'm afraid. It's important that we get the evidence on the record. So, at the expense of some brevity perhaps, if there are matters that in hindsight you wish to place upon the record, do please feel free to write to us. I hope that way we may be able to have our cake and eat it. Alex Davies-Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Suky, if I come to you first, please. Can you let the committee know why you feel that the stalking protection orders would be more beneficial, more effective and provide better protection to victims rather than restraining orders which are currently given in these circumstances?
Well, restraining orders are often given at the end of a criminal case. So again, you're not getting a protection through that journey. And we know how long those backlogs are in terms of getting cases to court. And similarly, there's a positive obligation that can be applied in a stalking protection order that you cannot have in a restraining order.
Thank you, Suky. Baroness Newlove, just one for you on intimate image abuse and the measures that we're bringing forward in the bill around the taking offence. Do you agree that the base offence, which has no requirement to prove intent, will allow the victim to have better access to have those intimate images that are taken without their consent in terms of better protections for those victims?
Yes, I do. I think it's a real big issue. And I was working on the online safety bill and listening to other social media problems. I do think the intent, because it's really important, because you can't then just skew with it the other way. And I think I do welcome what is in the bill for this. I mean, we could go more and more, but at least it's a start. So I do agree with that.
Thank you.
Harry Cross.
Probably best for Suky. Do you consider that the provisions in the bill and the bills or the acts that it relates back to, such as the Protection from Harassment Act, are sufficient to cover all forms of stalking? For example, does it cover online stalking enough, which is obviously becoming more and more prevalent? And I mean, the Harassment Act is back in '97 when the internet was a very different beast to what it is now.
I think there are certainly elements within the current legislation that don't draw enough attention on the impact and the alarm and distress that victims experience. There are challenges where victims themselves don't know that they're being stalked and might not see the extent of what's online, and that isn't captured within the full extent of the legislation though. So there is certainly development, but I think it's important that we're not too prescriptive with the behaviours, because what we don't want to do is allow perpetrators to be able to work outside of that. By allowing that to be to an extent vague, we future-proof the legislation.
Thank you very much.
No,
No,
I'll leave it to the expert.
All done? Thank you. Joe Platt, please.
Thank you, Sir Roger, and thank you for attending. I want to address the breach of protection orders, so it's more for Suky. So where the victims, there's a case in Wigan that I've been dealing with, so the victim's ex-partner obviously committed the most heinous crime, and given that more than half of stalking victims are by ex-intimate partners, do you think the bill goes far enough to address breach of protection orders, or could it go further?
I think it can go further. I mean, this was something that the Super Complaint Committee picked up quite clearly, that breaches are not being prosecuted robustly enough. To that end, we feel that actually there needs to be minimum sentencing in place for breaches to ensure that there is a clear deterrent that's being made to perpetrators, that if this order holds weight and if it is breached, you will be prosecuted.
Matt Bishop, please.
Thank you, Sir Roger. A question maybe for Baroness Newlove. Given that the intimate image abuse disproportionately affects women and girls, how do you think the changes will specifically help to address the unique challenges that women and girls face in seeking justice and support?
I don't think this is, I think the concerns is obviously this is all about regulations. I think one thing that I did find in here that I'm working closely with Ofcom as the Victims Commissioner. It feels very much that it's designed for individuals. It's not designed to really get the tech companies to show up and do what they're supposed to do. And so, you know, for me, it's about we need to get more of the tech companies having responsibility and not leaving it to the party that's actually been damaged.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Very well. Louise Jones, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is to Baroness Newlove. Obviously, cuckooing has pretty heinous crimes. It takes advantage of some very vulnerable victims. What impact on those do you think that the making cuckooing a specific offence will have?
You said cuckooing, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, no, don't get me started on cuckooing. Cuckooing is an interesting area, and I've been doing this for quite a long time on cuckooing, and I don't think people realise the level of how it harms complete families and destroys it. My concerns about cuckooing is really understanding and whether the government will, you know, the guidance for police and other operational partners, because cuckooing is, you know, it's not what you see on the soap operas. These are evil people that pick on vulnerable people that take over their lives. So whilst this bill creates a new offence whereby a person who commits an offence, if they exercise control of the dwelling, it sounds very blah, 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 blah. It's actually breaking down and educating people on how this can absolutely take over the most vulnerable. I mean, it all goes into, you know, exploitation, county lines. There's not one. So I don't want this. What I want this to do is to flow into all this mechanism. Cuckooing has to be stated, but we must put it alongside of exploitation, county lines, drugs, and everything. And that's my concern about this. When the guidance is published, also that victims of cuckooing do not realise they're being cuckooing. I don't know where they got the word cuckooing from anyway, but that was when I went out with the police many years ago. And I think it's really hard to break, because if that person thinks they're part of the family, as well as the huge threat to the family, it's very hard for that to recognise. But I do think that, you know, this must have a multi-agency approach, and it must be in capitals, and it must be where we report in. There has been many millions spent in this area, but I would like them to be more educated, and to get a professional. I know there's a professional toolkit that's been developed to disrupt cuckooing victimisation. I think it was issued to professionals in October 2024. But I do encourage authorities to utilise this. It's so important, and I've seen so much devastation. It is like watching a film on the screen, and this is real life for people as we're speaking today.
David Burton-Sampson.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Again, one for you, Baroness Newlove. It's nothing more frustrating than having your device stolen and you knowing where it is and the police not being able to act. So are you confident that the new powers in this bill will give the police what they need to be able to act in those situations when a device can be located?
I'm always confident of new powers. My reserve, shall I say, the caveat onto all of that, is actually using them in a sensible way. I've heard victims, and this is not, you know, this is anecdotal, but we hear it every day. You know, we're even told on Parliament to put our phones in our bags. You know, that's how bad it is. It's making sure that the police use this properly and understand it. And also that, you know, we're looking at technology, that they're equipped to be able to research this, you know, prevent this from happening in the first place. But I do think we need to protect victims from it. But unfortunately, I'm not hearing, anecdotally, that the police are actually doing something, and I think that's where we've got to get police better training, better understanding, and protecting victims. And victims are doing their own investigation, have phoned up the police and said, I know where my phone is, and actually the police do nothing. So while legislation's great for professionals, we've got to see the people on the ground delivering the victims.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? We've got a couple of minutes left. If either the... Yes, Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be in on one. Nudifying technology and those other sort of online tools, which obviously demean mainly women and girls, but others as well. What do you think we can do to look at that further? Is there parts of this bill where it should be put into? And is it an area in general that we're tackling sufficiently?
Is this to both of us or one of us?
Oh, sorry, Baroness Newlove. Sorry.
To be honest, I've not really looked into the detail, and obviously when it comes to the House of Laws, I'll be very vocal anyway in that sense. But I think we've got to educate. I've seen too many vulnerable victims, and I know the government's looking at this in the Vogue strategy. I mean, we had a round table with Jess Phillips, and it's amazing what technology is out there. But I think we need to educate people about technology of all ages to prevent them from being a domestic abuse victim. But tech companies need to be more responsible as well. When something really does harm a person, there's got to be accountability. And I think we have to bring them around the table. Unfortunately, we all work in silos. But it is about, we've got this, AI coming out, what damage that can do. We're already seeing parts of that. And that's why I welcome what's in the bill. But I do think, while we put this, they're about 50 steps ahead of it down the line, and there's other things coming up. But I do think we need to be alert, we need to be aware, and we need to want to understand and make it secure for people.
Sparky, you were nodding furiously. Would you like to add?
I just absolutely agree with Baroness Newlove there, and I think for us it's about conversation with those tech companies. Yes. Those products need to be safe by design, and all too often they're already hitting the market. We're seeing them being misused by perpetrators in ever innovative ways, and we're always behind that conversation. And I think we need to be at the forefront. Those specialist services need to be at the table with those tech companies to be ahead of that.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just picking up a comment you made, Baroness Newlove, around resources and officers. You know, the powers are all well and good, but just actually having the numbers to exercise the powers is the challenge. And I'm going to pick up a comment earlier from Tiff Lynch made about resources being used up by duties. And I guess it's just exploring how much you agree that the focus on neighbourhood policing is only, and the powers that are included in this bill, is only so useful if you don't have the officers and the numbers of individuals to actually exercise them. And do you see anything in the bill that actually gives you confidence that will happen?
I welcome any resource and extra police officers, I do, but I do think it's how they are mobilised. I have concerns that while we've got respect orders and we've got hotspot areas, it makes me feel I've gone back to 2007 with my late husband, because the hotspots were in the town centres and there was 40-odd police officers, but the communities had very, very little sighting of police. So while it comes from a good place, resourcing, they will fudge the resourcing around. I'm quite honest about that. And there was plenty of police officers in 2007. So it can't be you can't say there's not enough police officers. There was. And I think also that we've got to have neighbourhood police officers have got to be seen in the communities, not just in the town centres. That's my concern and always has been.
Baroness Newlove, we're indebted to you for your expertise. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
May we change the witnesses, please? Order, order. We're now going to hear oral evidence from the Internet Watch Foundation and Action for Children. We have until 3:40 for this panel. Would the witnesses be kind enough to introduce themselves to the record, please?
Yep.
Ladies
Good
first.
afternoon. My name is Sharon Maciver, and I'm the Director at Action for Children, responsible for our work on the criminal exploitation of children.
My name is Dan Sexton. I'm the CTO at the Internet Watch Foundation, and my work is tackling child sexual abuse material distribution and creation on the internet.
Thank you very much. And for the benefit of the Hansard writer and the chairman who's becoming increasingly hard of hearing, I think, and a lot of noise outside, I'd be grateful if you could speak up just a little. Thank you very much. Opposition front bench spokesman, please.
Yeah, having read the bill, is there anything that concerns you, anything you think we could improve upon, or is there any measures in the bill in this area that you would like to see added to the bill?
Yes, please.
Yes. The measures outlined within the bill are a significant step forward in providing a legal framework that specifically tackles the criminal exploitation of children. And we hear firsthand through the services that we deliver across Scotland, England and Wales the devastating impacts that exploitation has on children, on their families and on communities. We published a report last year that analysed safeguarding incidents that had occurred for 140 children. And within those incidents, what we found was 50 children had been stabbed as a result of criminal exploitation. A further 48 children had been harmed with weapons, including acid, dog chains, metal poles. That we heard a number of these children that had been physically harmed had not attended emergency services when they needed it. And so, for me, that there was an issue there when we think about the current system and the trust that children have in accessing the system that should be there to safeguard and protect them. So as a starting point, that we welcome the introduction of the new offence and the preventative orders in sanctioning those who choose to exploit children. In terms of the risks that we would see, that we welcome obviously the new offence, but we have some concerns around the wording in relation to how the offence would be applied to those children who are seen to be under the age of 18. The wording refers to an offence being committed if it is reasonably believed that the child is under 18. Last year we had a review into the criminal exploitation of children chaired by Professor Alexis Jay, and within that we heard significant evidence around concerns around the adultification of children, recognising that these children too often don't acknowledge their own exploitation and as such receive a justice response as opposed to a welfare first response. And so that's a consideration I think we need to make in terms of language first and foremost. And secondly, we welcome the prevention orders as part of this bill, but need to think about the potential impacts on children and how we feed back information to safeguard and protect them. So if we think about a prevention order or an offence being placed on an individual who chooses to exploit children, we need to think about whether that child is named as part of the offence and the potential repercussions that that could cause for them. However, if we choose not to name a child, how do we ensure that there's sufficient information shared amongst agencies that safeguards them, that makes them aware of the measures that might be imposed as part of this order? And that for us is of critical importance. In terms of the protections of children, I could go on to talk about measures we would like to see within the bill, but I appreciate that you may want to come in, or would you like me to continue?
I think we'd probably welcome anything in writing, wouldn't we, here after, if that's... Yeah,
Mr. Sexton, I think I should explain. The first question is very often an opportunity for witnesses to make a brief opening statement as well. So, Mr. Sexton, if you wish to broaden that, you're most welcome to do so. Mr. Sexton, please.
Thank you. So, IWF are very supportive of the measures introduced to tackle AI-generated child sexual abuse material. And I just want to outline why this is important and the evidence that we have for seeing this harm manifesting. Legislation is already robust in the UK for the content, whether it is real, generated, synthetic or hybrid. Child sexual abuse material is illegal, regardless of how it's created. However, what we've seen is the tools that have been released recently to enable you to create content are not. And this has created a loophole which we've seen exploited. So at the point you use this technology to create an image, the image is illegal and you have committed a crime, but the tooling is not. And that means that we have seen offenders train, create models, create manuals and guides, and the models and guides themselves, and the model is just a file, it's just a file in that case, it's been trained on child sexual abuse material, so the training process would have been committing crimes because you're accessing and using child sexual abuse at that point. The file itself that comes out the other end was not illegal, and neither was the guide. So those two things could be shared freely on the internet, effectively giving people a DIY child sexual abuse generation tool which they could download to create their own content. So this hope is that these clauses will firstly give us some ability to ban, remove, take down this content, but also crucially to remove some of the ambiguity there is online about what is legal and what is not. That ambiguity itself we see causes people to sometimes commit acts they would not have perhaps otherwise done had they known it was illegal. So very supportive of those measures. Thank you.
Are there any gaps you can see in the legislation or anything that needs tightening or to hit that need and that objective?
So I think
there are many things that we could be doing to improve online safety, many things that could be done to improve safer use of AI tools. However, in the context of this bill and the criminalisation of things, we think that these particular loopholes, it's done a good job of blocking. I think the other stuff was potentially better suited to things like Future Regulations, Online Safety Act and AI safety bills. So very much content with these clauses.
Yeah, in terms of inclusion we would want to see in the bill, we would like to see greater protections for children and feel that in order to have an end-to-end response to tackling the criminal exploitation, not only do we need to have measures that sanction exploiters, but also protect children, recognising that children who are criminally exploited will be victims of abuse whilst also being in conflict with the law. In terms of building trust within the system, as I reference in terms of children's trust, I think there's also a requirement for agencies working in this space to feel confident that the system can respond to this issue. And often we see children, as I've described, being significantly harmed. But also as a result of exploitation, they cause significant harm to others. And that's a really complex dilemma for agencies to try to manage. And so we feel that having increased protection orders that specifically address the duality of a child being a victim as well as in conflict with the law would be helpful, as well as ensuring children have access to a statutory defence. We also believe that a definition of criminal exploitation would be helpful in understanding the scale and extent of this problem and how many victims there are across the UK. Of course, the new offence will ensure that data is captured on the number of perpetrators. We would equally want to make sure that we understand how many victims there are and ensure that the response we have, that the system feels confident, agencies feel confident in terms of what that system does for children.
Alex Davies-Jones.
Thank you. Mr Sexton, this bill introduces a number of new offences banning CSA imagery. One of the new offences is a specific offence targeting the administrators and moderators of the CSA sites, these sites and these groups. How prevalent are these groups? And do you think that the new criminal offence will actually deter offenders from even establishing these sites?
So we see sites coming up frequently. At any given time, we have around 200 websites dedicated to sharing and hosting child sexual abuse material on our list, and that rotates. We often see those sites moving, so it's the same administrator, same site, and every time they get taken down in one place, they move from the other another, which does suggest that the administrators and the people behind it are not getting caught, they are not being prosecuted. So I'm unsure as to the effect that the bill will have, considering that those particular administrators are already clearly committing crimes, both in this country and in many countries, and they're not getting caught in that case. I would like to see whether the new clauses extend beyond just the site administrator to everyone else that's in the chain. So a website does not just appear out of nowhere. Yeah. It is not just the administrator. There is a lot of parts of that are required for a site to appear. And actually, if there are greater obligations on everyone else in that chain, you may find it much harder for those administrators to create and run their sites in the first place. A lot of our work is about introducing friction and making it harder to create and share child sexual abuse material. Not necessarily one part of that is arresting people, but there's a lot of other stuff that could be done just to make it harder for the crime to happen.
Thank you. Just one more, if I may. One of the issues that has been raised with us is that artificial intelligence imagery of child sexual abuse doesn't really have impact real-world victims. Do you want to speak to that point? Because I think it's an important one to make and get on the record.
It is one, and it is one that does come up frequently. And there are a couple of bits of evidence that I can offer here to show where that is untrue. For instance, and I think the intention behind Clause 36 on AI models is very much tailored towards this, is we see models that have been trained specifically on child sexual abuse, often trained on particular victims. Offenders will collect images of a particular victim, and what these tools have given them is the ability not just to complete their collections, but create more content of children that have already been abused, sometimes many years ago. See, these are victims or survivors now, and not only is their abuse not finished, but they're getting more content being created. In one instance, we found 128 individual models, each trained on a specific victim with the intention of creating more imagery of those victims. So it is not a victimless crime. We very specifically, that's 128 victims we see just there.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Do you want to come in? No comment. No? Anna Sabine, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a point that was raised in some of our written evidence. I think it's probably best aimed at action for children. It was to do with the proposed sentencing under the proposed CCE offence compared with the Modern Slavery Act. And it talks about the fact that the proposed sentencing for child criminal exploitation is going to be 10 years, which is much shorter than the penalties under the Modern Slavery Act, which is up to life imprisonment, and how this might create a perverse incentive around the fact that, not an incentive, but a perverse situation where, you can be sentenced for child criminal exploitation and get much less than you would under the Modern Slavery Act. I wondered if you just had any views on that.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned in my introduction, that the harms caused to children are lifelong, they're traumatic, and they devastate children, young people and their communities. So in terms of the length of sentence, I don't suppose there's any length of sentence that would be justifiable in terms of the harms that are caused to exploitation, and I would share the concerns around what you described around the length of time versus the modern slavery versus what's described in this bill, and we would want to see that increase.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about the criminal exploitation prevention orders, and I noted what you said about the sanctions on the exploiters, but the need to protect children. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about what you would want to see in terms of that protection that's offered to children.
Yeah. Yes. At the moment, we have a system whereby children who are exploited will be in conflict with the law at the same time as we seek to protect them, recognising them as victims of abuse. And what that causes children to have to do is go through two opposing systems, one that seeks to protect them and one that seeks to find justice. And we know that children cannot consent to their own exploitation, nor should we be criminalising children who are abused in this way. However, we do know that the behaviours that children are exploited into are particularly concerning, and they do cause significant harm to others, and there will be victims within that. And so we feel that having a dedicated child exploitation order that addresses their behaviours proportionately and appropriately without a criminal label attached to it is a real way to manage the risks that these children could potentially pose to others whilst ensuring the correct protections for themselves.
So that would sit along if there was a criminal offence that was taken through the courts. You could make the criminal exploitation prevention order, and you're also saying a child exploitation order.
Yeah.
That would all fit together.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. And can I also just ask you as well about, is your view that now, because in the past the Modern Slavery Act has been relied on a lot to try and deal with these issues of exploitation of children, do you think having this standalone offence, is this going to deal with the problem that we've identified that the Modern Slavery Act isn't able to tackle in terms of exploitation of children and young people?
Yeah. I certainly think the offence is part of the solution, as well as ensuring we protect children. I think where the modern slavery has fallen short is not specifically talking about criminal exploitation and assuming exploitation in other forms. So that has been a limiting factor in gathering the suitable evidence to prosecute. As well as we've obviously suggested that there needs to be a clear definition of a criminally exploited child. And I think within the Modern Slavery Act, there's the assumption that children are victims of trafficking, that we need to prove that there's been issues around modern slavery specifically. So a new offence will talk about the behaviours and the concerns that we've got for criminal exploitation in its own right.
Right, thank you.
Matt Bishop.
Thank you, Chair. Question to Ms Maciver. How will the measures on child criminal exploitation help to ensure there's a more effective and consistent response to child criminal exploitation?
I think having a clearly defined offence will offer police increased powers to disrupt and sanction these individuals, and it shifts the focus around what these individuals are doing. We know often from our work that children idolise these people who are exploiters. They don't see them as exploiters and see them as people with status and reputation. They certainly do not see themselves as child abusers and would not want to go to prison for abusing children. So we hope that in itself will be a suitable deterrent in avoiding the use of children in their activity. And just yesterday, one of the members of staff had contacted us to say he'd received a text message from a child who was missing and had been for 3 days, and he felt he couldn't go home because his house would be targeted. His house had previously had the window smashed in on 2 occasions. He was stabbed on the street 3 months ago several times by a gang, and the text message said, "I will be murdered if I'm seen on the street. It's me against 100 people." So I feel we don't have the option not to do something about this, given this is the harms that are being caused to children every single day, and that child didn't feel he could trust the system enough to support him. He was trying to manage his own exploitation in that situation.
Thank you, Chair.
No comment, thank you.
Clarence Curtis, please.
The Chair. Mr. Sexton, I just want to go back to what you were talking about on the administrators, moderators aspect, and you were talking about people in the chain needing to look at that. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. Is that people who host websites, or perhaps you could just expand on that, and then maybe for both of you, to preempt what you're about to say, but presumably this is obviously not going to be just domestic, it's obviously then going to be international, so what, if anything, this could do, or what sort of partnerships and sort of cross-agency working both here and abroad would help sort of target the issue we're talking about there?
So certainly, it's on the clear web. In order to get a website, you need to have IP address, you need to have a domain name. A domain name will come from a registrar, a registry. So in the UK, we have .co.uk run by Nominet. Just removing, for instance, the registrars, there being some liability for them enabling a site that is hosting child sexual abuse material. We work with those companies every day to say there's child sexual abuse material here, and some of them are very good, and some of them are less good. It is really not our problem. We don't deal with the content. So anything that encourages those to act proactively rather than reactively, but even reactively, you take away the domain name, there is no website. It disappears. Those sites are hosted on, a lot of them are public clouds, so they might be on Cloudflare, Amazon, Google, so there are lots of parts of that chain, and most of those are sort of content agnostic, so the content is not we're just offering the service. But really it takes a lot of people to sort of collude in order to create a website of any type. If that website is hosting criminal content, child sexual abuse material, take all of those parts of that chain taking more responsibility. We see a lot of this is not our fault, it's the people downstream, it's the people upstream. Obviously the administrators are the ones that are running that stuff, but there's lots of other people that had to be part of that in order for those sites to work. So I'd like to see more reason for those sites to take action, and that it will be extremely helpful for our work of finding and removing that content, getting it down as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Very much. Any further questions? No? In that case, Mr. Bhaker, Mr. Sexton, thank you very much indeed for your evidence. Committee is again indebted to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you both.
We shall now hear oral evidence from the Local Government Association and the leader of the Conservative group on the London Assembly. We have until not later than 4:10 for this panel. Could the witnesses please, ladies first, identify themselves for the record?
Thank you. I'm Councillor Sarah Conway here on behalf of the LGA.
And I'm Neil Garrett, the leader of the Conservative group at the London Assembly.
Thank you very much indeed. Matt Vickers.
Having read the bill, is there anything that particularly concerns you? Is there anything that you think we could improve upon? Or are there any measures you'd like to see in the bill that aren't there as it stands?
Shall I go first?
Okay, I don't mind. We can take it in turns.
Okay, shall I go first? So one of the concerns I have, so at the London Assembly, a big part of our work is scrutinising the Met Police, and so people's concerns about policing, particularly around protests, which we've had quite a lot of disruptive protests recently in London. So there are some concerns, I think, about finding the balance between the way the police and, in fact, the courts interpret what powers the police have to police protests, as opposed to what I think the general public, as expressed to me, think. And I think it goes in two directions, actually. It's not all one-way traffic. So if I start with the disruptive protests, I think my perception is there's a gap in the bill, or perhaps an opportunity in the bill to do something about that. And the issue is, if you look at the existing Public Order Act, Section 12, it sets out this gap between substantial and minor disruption to the community, and on the face of it, it seems a perfectly reasonable and sensible way to distinguish between significant disruption, which the police ought to act on to remove protesters, versus minor disruption, which is just a normal part of life. The way the courts have interpreted that has led the police, well, so we've challenged the Commissioner on this, on his officers not acting to remove, for example, people who just park themselves in the road, people do all, gluing themselves to things, locking onto things. His challenge to us is that his officers are enforcing the law as it exists and as it has been interpreted by the courts. And in particular, I think the Ziegler judgment essentially sets, to my mind, I think, a very high bar for what constitutes that substantial disruption. And for example, when people just park themselves in the road, block the road, that's not considered a substantial disruption. I think I would like to see some thought in the bill to how the police could be empowered to, while making sure that people can still protest in the way that they would like, and that is an important democratic freedom, that other people who just want to go about their life and go about their day aren't prevented. And I mentioned in the other direction as well, I think there's also a challenge that I see, again, not addressed, I think, in the bill, but potentially could be, around what I might think of as a sort of emerging de facto blasphemy law, which is quite concerning. So people who wish to protest almost always are annoying somebody in some way on the issue that they want to protest about. Very rarely do people protest in favour of or against things where everyone agrees with them. And I think there is a concern that I have where that nature of that protest touches on religious or sort of very cherished beliefs. People often react very negatively to that. And you then see the police and seemingly the courts viewing it that the person who is reacting angrily to the protest is in some way the victim, and the protester is in some way a protagonist, a cause of the problem, when I think, having removed a blasphemy law in 2008, the will of Parliament seems to be that you are allowed to offend people's religious sensibilities. And we saw the example in Manchester with the burning of the Quran. There was an example by the Turkish embassy in London. Numerous examples along these lines where Section 4A, maybe Section 4 of the Public Order Act, seems to be used to determine that if you're causing harassment or alarm or distress, that is enough to block somebody from being able to carry out what otherwise would seem to be quite a peaceful protest. So I think in both of those two directions, I think there's scope for this bill to address both of those problems.
Yes, I wasn't going to comment on this, but I will on the bit about protests. We really welcome the Home Secretary's amendment to the bill that was announced last night in terms of the intimidation at places of religious worship. And as a Barnet local councillor, obviously that has been a key area of focus for our communities during the past year and a half in particular. And I think that balance between intimidation and right to protest has been very fairly dealt with and is a very welcome introduction to this bill. I'm really pleased that we're here today as the local council. Local councils and councillors and our officers are at the front line of all the delivery of community safety and keeping everybody safe and protected in our boroughs and district councils and all the areas across the country. I think every point that I've kind of got on our list to make focuses on resources. There's some really good stuff in this bill, but it needs careful working through so that there isn't a kind of obligation and statutory duty there without the resourcing to really properly deliver it on the ground. Also training, and I can give examples as we go through with specifics that are needed, and completely on collaboration. That's something that local government as leaders of place are very good at, but we need the resourcing to do it. I know local government talks in every space at the moment about resources, but it is very essential, particularly in certain areas to do with social services, etc., with some of the duties there. Broadly overall, though, we really welcome this bill. There are some really important measures there in terms of the cuckooing provision, the child protection, all of that sort of thing, that as someone who leads on community safety on the ground are very vital. There are measures in this bill that will save us having to try and find different ways around things and actually directly go to the heart of the problem. And I think that what is really key is to keep talking to local government, particularly on fly tipping. You can't see the word fly tipping as a local councillor and not have something to say. That is an area I think it would be great for the LGA to be having further in-depth discussions with the government on as to how that is delivered locally and effectively, and we're absolutely vital on that.
Thank you. Before we proceed, could I just, for the benefit again of the Hansard writer and myself, ask you if you could speak up just a little?
Sorry.
There's a certain amount of background noise that comes through from outside, and it makes it quite difficult at this end of the room to hear.
So you beat me to the shout. I was about to say about fly tipping. Huge costs to local authorities across the country. What do you think of what's proposed in the bill? How do you think you could go further and improve on that? And at one point there was a suggestion that you might give people penalty points on their driving licence if they use vehicles to dump things. What do you do on all of that? What do you think of the measures? How can we make it stronger?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. And I hope you can hear me now. Sorry. Yes, is that better? We think as the LGA that we really need to sit down and go through all of that very, very thoroughly. It would be very welcome to have that conversation. Also to have in place the long-term funding, the ability to work together, because some of this sits with the Environment Agency as well, and just how we properly do that together and to understand more about this. Fly tipping, obviously, those solutions need to be delivered locally, and local government's key to that. So we'd really welcome a detailed conversation on that.
You're asking me specifically about fly tipping. I mean, on fly tipping, I think you probably would get almost universal agreement that it's too much of a problem and more needs to be done about it. I think on my reading of the bill, all that seems to be being proposed is that essentially the Secretary of State write to councils and remind them of the powers that they have. And I think if I were to go back to my local council and ask them what they thought of that, they probably would think it's quite patronising. And they probably would say that a better remedy might be more resources or possibly more powers. But I think they probably know what powers they have. That's my experience of senior council officers.
Specifically on powers, is there anything you think you need that you haven't got in that space that we might be able to?
I think resourcing is an issue, and I suppose I'm bound to say as well that prioritisation can be an issue. So we've seen, councils change control, and a new administration decides that it's more of a priority, so they make it more of a focus. I think perhaps the one area that is again a gap between where the law is and where public perception would be is when you have private land that is adjacent to the highway. So if it's on the highway, it's a council responsibility. They can use their resources. They can deal with it. If it's adjacent to the highway and possibly looks as if it might be part of the highway but actually isn't, you get these sort of little bits of land often on corners and things. It's technically private property, which means it's the property owner's responsibility. Council, particularly with the resource constraint, isn't enthusiastic about spending their resources on someone else's property. That, I think, is an area where there's a question mark at the moment.
I think also, just to note, that councils do not have the powers to take enforcement action against large-scale fly tipping, which has been quite a focus recently, or where criminal activity is involved. So any statutory guidance would need to be clear on this point. There's a lot that we do locally in terms of targeting on fly tipping. We've actually announced today as a local council some very successful work we've been doing, but there's gaps here that needs resolving together.
In terms of measures on antisocial use of vehicles and being able to seize them without notice, etc., in my part of the world, huge problem faced by the council and the police. What's your experience of it? Do you think we need to be doing more than we're doing in this bill? You realise that this isn't the only power that police and local government have to act on it, but what more can we do in that space?
Well, I think it is a problem, and I think the measure to allow seizing of a vehicle effectively on one action rather than two actions. The problem as the law stands is the police officer would have to witness it happening, speak to the person to give them a warning, and then wait for it to happen again. So obviously if they just drive away, then they've got away with it, obviously. So I think the measure in the bill to allow effectively to allow the police officer potentially to seize it at that first instance, I think that's useful. Particularly, I mean, what we're talking about, I think we see it around London as well, and you see it sometimes streamed live on social media where people effectively meet up, they're donutting around car parks, driving up and down, huge crowds of people, very, very close. It's a public safety issue, overwhelmingly, and being able to simply seize those vehicles at that point would be a very useful power.
And in terms of the ability to take them from a private dwelling, so there are limitations about where they can be seized from by the police, including a private dwelling. Do you have a view on that? Or?
In terms of vehicles, I think that's positive. If I can say something else as well about private dwellings not relating to, or properties not relating to vehicles, I think the provisions around GPS tracked devices, whether that's mobile phones, bicycles, all kinds of things now you can stick a GPS tag on, that's an extremely useful power that I think we welcome. I will say it also does require the police to decide that it's a priority to track those things. Dr. Newport, who I believe is coming later, changed his bike outside Scotland Yard, who definitely have the power to look at their own CCTV and chose not to. So that's a challenge which will remain. But I think we have seen in London, I produced a report a couple of months ago, essentially every 6 minutes a mobile phone is being stolen in London. It's increasing year on year. London, as we did some polling, majority of Londoners now are wary in the way they use their phone. You know, you see people sort of turning away or going into doorways, essentially because the criminals who are stealing those phones are operating in a fairly risk-free environment. So anything that introduces some countermeasures to that, I think, is very welcome, and I think making it easier for police to track and apprehend those people is very welcome.
You want to come in?
Yes, thank you very much. So on cars, obviously it's something we welcome in terms of a peaceful and respectful environment, and are very, very aware of the issues that can happen locally with that. Obviously, increased collaboration between councils and police may require further resourcing, but I would also note, again, we are already delivering that, you know, on the ground. Certainly we do that quite a lot, but it would be very welcome to have this increased focus and more resourcing. I just wanted to pick up on phones, actually, that I was fortunate to be there for the LGA at the Mobile Phone Summit that the Home Secretary is doing, and that the Minister was there, which is very, very welcome. I would also note, again, through a proactive relationship with our local police force, there's really effective action happening, and I think that local councils have a real role in how we work as leaders of place and tackle the crimes that affect people's everyday life. I would also add on that we're very fortunate in Barnet, I'll speak as a Barnet councillor at this point, to be funded by the Mayor for London a specific violence reduction unit project over the next 2 years that is designed exactly to tackle the mobile phone issues with a whole range of after-school activities, enabling people to mark their property, etc. I think there are solutions to things, and we really welcome the framework this bill is giving, but local government does need resourcing to deliver effectively on some of the obligations that are coming in. Thank you.
Can I make an additional point, actually, closely connected to that? There are new powers proposed, Section 78, 80 and 81, around SIM farms and electronic devices used for vehicle offences, which I think we welcome. Those are good measures. A useful suggestion would be that in 2023 an additional power was added to stop and search, which would allow, relating to lock-on type offences, which would allow police to stop and search someone on the basis that they were looking for, you know, equipment that would be used for a lock-on type protest. So with these new offences relating to SIM farms and the kind of electronic USB devices that plug into your car and allow them to steal it, it potentially would be useful to add additional stop and search power relating to those, so that police would then be able to stop and search people who they believe are equipped for those crimes. Because otherwise it potentially would leave a gap where that there is a new crime that's been created, but a difficulty for the police potentially to enforce that.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Roger. I just wanted to mention that I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that there's been a lot of public order and protest legislation in the last few years, and I think the previous government agreed that they were going to have post-legislative scrutiny of the 23 Act, and that will be happening from this year, as well as some of the other public order legislation. But I wanted to ask specifically from the Local Government Association about antisocial behaviour and the respect orders that are within the bill, and the strengthening of some of the powers that were in the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Bill in 2014. Just wondered for a reflection about how the respect orders and those other powers being increased, how will that help local authorities deal with antisocial behaviour?
So I think anything that can help local authorities deal with antisocial behaviour is very welcome. In terms of the respect orders, I guess it's welcome that this will become a criminal offence in terms of the breach of the order, and that will set off a different process, which is important. Again, though, there are pressures on local authorities from doing this. I would note two sort of caveats with this. One is the new ASB data reporting requirements that may cause pressures in certain areas, and I think again needs a dialogue with government about how to do that really effectively. And then also the new duty for police and crime commissioners, which will bolster the role of the Victims Commissioner in ASB case reviews. We just want to caution that works okay with the Victims and Prisoners Act, and that it doesn't set up two sort of different systems happening, and that there's that consistency on the ground. In terms of ASB itself, again, if I can just speak locally for a minute or two, we have been fortunate to be London's first pilot of Clearhole Build. We're nearly 2 years into that, and overall crime remains down 20% year on year across the board on there. The other thing I think that it's done is taken a collaborative approach into our policing and partnership. In my particular ward, which had a lot of issues going on, ASB is down 65%, which is extraordinary. Burglary is down 67%, and violence against the person is down 59%. Those results don't just happen. So I think with all of this, an effective, proactive local government and partnership and the police and everyone working together is really vital. So we really welcome this, but it's how we do it in practice on the ground. And I think local government obviously has a very strong story to tell, and that dialogue through this bill, and once it's introduced, will be really important as well to demonstrate how it is working on the ground. So thank you for the powers, hopefully to be able to do more.
Well, thank you for that. Can I just say that you gave some really interesting statistics there. So you're obviously collating data already in your local authority area. I'm assuming most local authority areas would be collating data around ASB. So I just want to be clear. I don't think the intention is to put further burdens on local government. I think it's to actually allow that data to be put together so there is a clear picture of what's happening around ASB around the country. So I'm assuming that that's not going to be too much of a burden.
Well, I've got it quite firmly here, and I think that there is a variety across local authorities. I'm also aware, without stuff I maybe can or can't say publicly, that sometimes you have to draw on other funding to enable systems to happen and to work effectively. So again, I would say, and we would say, it needs carefully looking at, also so that something works everywhere, not just in specific areas, and that dialogue with local government is essential on that.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much. And it's see Neil as my ward councillor and council colleague in Sutton. We have a lot of understanding of, and I'm going to focus on seizure of motor vehicles, and it's something that we have an issue with on our high street in Sutton. Although I'm going to take a slightly different angle, and I'm going to question whether yourself and Sarah think that the powers might go too far, in that the ability to seize vehicles without warning, without an initial pushback on the behaviour, whether that potentially gives too much powers to the police, and there might be a risk of that being, I don't want to say misused, but kind of over-policing I don't know whether you've got thoughts on that, and specifically the Sutton example is a good one. I think obviously you're covering Croydon as well on your London Assembly seat. There might be slightly more rural questions covering Croydon. And Sarah, I don't know whether you've got any slightly different examples from across the LGA area of which you're obviously representing.
Gerrard.
I think you're right to flag that up because, so I spoke earlier about why I think it is potentially a benefit that police don't have to catch the same person twice. That's how I spoke to a police officer about this, and that's essentially how he described it to me, is that the way the law stands, you have to catch the same person twice. And he gave me the example of the Ace Cafe in London, where it's a motorbike issue rather than a car issue. Keeping track of precisely which person you've given a warning to recently is tricky, and sometimes the behaviour can be so egregious that it's well beyond what would require a mere warning, but it does require a warning, and then they ride off and they're gone. But I think you're right to flag up the possibility of, is it possible that the threshold at which that, what might have been a warning, turns into a seizure? I think that is absolutely a concern. And I suppose, in a way, it relates to my point earlier about the levels of protest disruption. Parliament sends some words out into the world, and how that gets interpreted by the police or the courts takes on a life of its own. So I would certainly want to see provision in the bill to make sure that it isn't abused or that it couldn't be abused. But I do think fundamentally that as a matter of practical policing, I think not having to catch the same person and the same vehicle and the same kind of act twice is a benefit from the new proposed bill.
I think from us, we can certainly send more information in to give a sort of range of experience across the country. Speaking specifically for what I've observed locally, those powers would be very welcome. There's often times where cars are used for all sorts of other things that's going on in an area and completely blight a local street or area or park or whatever. So I think it's really important to be able to have those powers and to see how it goes. But we're happy to follow up on that with some more detail.
Sorry, if I may add, that point about persistence in the same place that Councillor Conway mentioned, I think that's very important. Some people don't see this problem from one year to the next. Other people see it almost every week.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for your evidence today. Councillor Garrett, I wanted to refer to remarks that you made earlier around kind of public order measures and protests and the concerns that you quite rightly have around some of the protests that we've seen in London. I wondered if you could speak to some of the specific provisions in the bill, particularly around creating a new criminal offence for concealing your identity at a protest, an offence of climbing on specified war memorials, and the offence of wearing or displaying articles in support of prescribed organisations. How do you think the practical application of some of these measures will help in London to deal with some of those public order concerns that you addressed earlier?
So I welcome all of those provisions you've just listed. I think they're all positive. I think I might have seen them somewhere before, in fact. What I would say, so when we at the Assembly press police on how they police protests, I think there are two sets of problems. One is the issue around powers, what they can or can't do, which I spoke about earlier. The courts have decided they simply cannot remove somebody from a road simply for sitting in a road, if it's a protest. On the other hand, there is a practical problem in the sense that if you have a very large protest, for example, the ones we've seen on Saturday mornings in particular, but you have a very large group of people and a limited number of police officers, the practical ability to carry out what you might think of as a sort of snatch operation is a risk-based decision that the senior officer on the site would have to make. And so that potentially would be one of the ways in which those new provisions don't necessarily make much difference. If the police judge that it is difficult for them in practice to, for example, if you have a crowd of 1,000 people all wearing face masks, what exactly is the practical step that the police would be able to take to do that? So I welcome the provision. I think it is a good idea that people climbing on war memorials wearing face masks, and in particular I would say some of those particularly unpleasant, being unpleasant is not against the law, but the ones that appear to be supporting terrorist organisations, inciting violence against groups of people, I'm very on board with those. The question mark I have in my mind is whether the police have either the resources or on balance, the willingness to go into a large crowd of people who probably won't welcome their arrival to actually enforce those provisions.
Councillor Conway, no?
I suppose just a short comment that we think the measures are broadly welcome. We'll obviously have to see how they go in practice, but there is something fundamental that is needed, as has been shown over the past sort of year or so, about the way in which you balance the very legitimate right that we have to enshrine to protest and how people feel intimidated, and that I think that's a wider discussion than just this bill, in terms of how it is possible to disagree. We had this conversation at something last week, to disagree agreeably, and I think some of this with the face masks, etc., sets a basic code of how you engage in public life and public space.
Thank you, Roger. I'd like to look at the requirement to report where there's a reasonable suspicion of child sexual abuse to, amongst others, local authorities. From your point of view, sort of in your positions, how do you think local authorities are set up to receive those sort of, what am I looking for? When someone has reported reports, when someone has reported, and is that something that you think the local authorities should be getting involved in?
Shall I start? So I'm going to read this out, if that's okay, because I think it's not that it isn't all an important issue, but I think this really is. So child sexual abuse is obviously a horrific crime, and the LGA supports the mandatory reporting duty. We do, however, have several things to say on this, and that would make it more effective. So we believe that there should be training and support for those working with children. Multiple reports included by Ofsted and the Home Office have identified a lack of skills and confidence amongst professionals in responding to child sexual abuse. A duty must not be placed on professionals without the accompanying training that will enable them to identify and respond to child sexual abuse effectively. We also believe that there needs to be support for victims, and that there can be a shortfall in dedicated support for boys, children from ethnic minority backgrounds, and disabled children. If this duty identified more victims of sexual abuse, obviously it would also be imperative that services are in place to provide appropriate support. On that, I would also add in the pressure on children's social care. Sorry, I'm trying to project again. I realised I was fading as I was looking down. So the duty may result in an increase in referrals to children's social care, as has occurred in other areas where mandatory reporting has been introduced, such as Australia, parts of Australia and America. And obviously this is in a context where spending on children's social care has already increased by 11% in the last financial year to £14.2 billion. So we believe that it is absolutely vital that children's social care is adequately resourced to ensure that all referrals can be fully investigated with the best possible support provided, including where children obviously need to be brought into care for their own protection. And I guess we'd also add, just on safe spaces, that very fine line between creating a space of trust and then a space of reporting, and that's something obviously that local government sits at the heart of. Thank you.
If I may, I would say broadly welcome the duty to report. I have two concerns that I would raise about that. Number one, there doesn't seem to be, apologies if I've missed it, but there doesn't seem to be any sanction on anyone who does not carry out that duty. So I would question what kind of a duty it is if you simply can choose not to do it, and with no ramification. And connected to that, if you think about the way that this might happen within an organisation of some sort, that person who's making that report might, in effect, be in a whistleblower position. So what thought is there to any duty on the employer not to then treat that particular employee adversely as a result of, in effect, blowing the whistle against things that they may wish not to have come to light? And the third thing that I would say, or perhaps it's a question, is to what extent this duty would apply to voluntary or religious organisations. We've seen, unfortunately, more than one example of child abuse occurring within religious settings, where often there's trust. Where often there's trust, and there's sometimes difficulty with anybody coming forward because of a sense of mutual solidarity that makes it difficult for people to want to step away and as I say, blow the whistle. So those, I think, are the three areas I would concern. Is there a sanction for not carrying out this duty? Is there an obligation on employers to do something to protect that person? And would it apply to religious settings?
Lauren Sullivan.
Lovely, thank you, Chair. And just to declare an interest, I am still a county councillor. I've resigned from Gratian Borough Council, so with a kind of council kind of hat on. Just looking at fly tipping. So Gratian Borough Council did 386 community protection warnings and about 50 fly tipping fines. So there's definitely a growing issue with fly tipping and going forward. I wonder if I could ask your advice whether you think that actually some of the guidance maybe to courts about the recovery costs, because we know fly tipping largely is organised crime, and actually the recovery costs in collecting rubbish, often from private landowners, they're left to bear the brunt of the burden. So maybe perhaps courts and magistrate courts in particular, would guidance in covering the kind of the costs of the crime, would that be welcome perhaps?
Gerrard?
Possibly. I suppose I wouldn't add much to what I said before about the fly tipping provisions in the bill, which seem to boil down to reminding local authorities of what their responsibilities are, and I do think that they already know what they are, and probably not to echo Councillor Conway, I think they probably would just say the word resources again and again.
So that's always a welcome echo. I would just add that the LGA wants to work with the government and the Sentencing Council to review court guidance, so yes, what you're talking about, ensuring stringent fines for the worst offenders and providing adequate funding for councils to investigate and prosecute fly tippers. As I'm sure you'll be aware, locally, councils face financial challenges in prosecuting fly tippers, the fines issued by the courts often lower than civil penalties. So it's essential for courts to properly prosecute to deter repeat offences as well. That there's a financial bit and then the deterrence effect. Thank you.
Organised crime element of it. Yeah, no, thank you.
Sabine.
Thank you, Chair. In light of my colleague describing Croydon as rural, I'd like to point out that I'm from a properly rural seat in Somerset. And one of the things I wanted to mention about fly tipping was that this actually gets mentioned by farmers a lot to me as an issue, partly because they're quite often dealing with it if it's on their land, and partly because they consider that many of the perpetrators of fly tipping are also the kind of people that are committing wider rural crime. I guess this is primarily for Sarah. From your LGA point of view, representing lots of more rural councils, do you feel there's more the bill could be doing to support councils in dealing with rural crime?
So I think we'd need to write in on about that with more details, if that's okay. The board I sit on definitely has people that I think would have a lot to say about that, but for specific information, I think we should write to you on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill makes a new offence for cookering. I'm particularly interested in your opinion. Obviously, a lot of cookering will take place, unfortunately, on council properties. And having lived on a street previously where cooking was going on, I've seen firsthand the impact on the wider neighbourhood as well. And so interested to get your views on how effective this is and how welcome this is.
I welcome the provision. Again, there's a hint of deja vu about it, but I think this is a serious, we talk about county lines type crime. Often in London, we are the originator of that, not me personally. We are the originator, and therefore we are dealing with the holders of those lines. And this type of crime where people are, taking over, often in quite unpleasant ways, a vulnerable individual's property, it's currently quite difficult. There are a number of provisions that connect to it. For example, some of the modern slavery provisions. But I think having a specific offence that specifically relates to that particular type of crime, which is definitely prevalent and definitely needs tackling, I think I welcome wholeheartedly.
So we are echoing a bit here, which is good. So to echo that, we very much welcome this. I note that case studies from councils were actually used to argue for the provisions contained in the bill, that the LGA's Modern Slavery Network will be publishing further case studies, that obviously the link with modern slavery and violence against women and girls strategy, it has to all talk to each other. We really welcome it. I mean, for me personally, I've signed closure orders on behalf of residents to stop issues, that everything that comes with this, not just, as you say, in the property itself, but for a local authority or for the residents in that area. And I think what we've noticed, that again through Clear Hold Build, I can't help but reference it because it has fundamentally changed the way things are happening locally, together with a proactive policing approach by our local police. It has fostered that more collaborative approach. And the more you have residents able to speak up and feel that they're heard and that authorities will listen and recognise the problem that's on the ground, the more effective we can all be. So, it's been a long time coming, this one. Thank you.
Joe Robertson.
Thank you, Chair. To the extent it's relevant, I draw attention to my declaration of interest in that I am a serving Isle of Wight councillor. If I would just take the panel back to section 45.2, this duty to report, I note that the police and local authorities are treated as interchangeable in terms of who a person must report to. I just invite any more thoughts around that, the idea that the police and local authorities are somehow interchangeable and have similar skill sets. I think, Councillor Conway, you referred to the training that would be needed with local authorities. But clearly there's so many different ways you could report, where the police are used to reporting of criminal activity. The council do not routinely receive reports in that way. I just wanted sort of inviting you to make either of you make any more comments around that slightly unexpected, unusual interchangeability of police and local authorities.
Councillor Conway.
So again, we'd be happy to write in with more detail on that. I think where that relationship works effectively, I understand the interchangeability. Sorry, that's a difficult word sometimes. But I also think it probably needs looking at. But there are effective systems on the ground that do enable that. But maybe it needs looking at more closely. But we can send information.
Yeah, my observation would be that if we're dealing with criminal behaviour, which I think we are dealing with in this circumstance, then the obvious place to report it to would be the police. Now, I don't know whether there is a provision for reporting to the council if someone's perhaps already involved with a social worker. That might be deemed to be an adequate way to report it. But I think my thought would be that if the purpose of this provision is to make sure that these crimes are investigated and prosecuted, then the obvious place to report that to would be the police.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I think my questions have been answered, but I will just ask while I've got the floor. The bill gives the ability to extend community safety accreditation schemes, basically allowing councils to take on more powers that would normally only be available to the police. Can I ask if you think that's a good thing for your local authorities?
Yeah, I feel like we should have a buzzer system here, really. So I think the general point around all of that is that the additional funding is needed to increase the CSP capacity to actually be able to deliver things on the ground, and that the reforming the duty and partnership landscape to ensure that the partnerships are equipped with the powers and partners to deliver would be very important on that.
I would add that simply, so on the ground, in practical terms, very often dealing with crime and connected behaviour very often does involve partnership between the local council and the police and other bodies as well, the probation service and so on. So it's quite normal, in fact it's good practice for there to be collaborative working. And so my observation would be that if you have a process of collaborative working that is working well, and I think for example in Croydon and in Sutton we have that, it seems to me to make little sense not to be able to extend it.
If I could just add as well, I think the preventative aspect is important as well within that, and to focus on it. And just before this meeting, I was in the London's Violence Reduction Unit meeting with the Safer Partnership chairs, where I'm aware that the government's new provision around preventative partnerships is evolving, which I think again runs alongside this and is a really important step forward.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Councillor Conway, my ears pricked up when you talked about Clear Hole Build and the successes that you had, and that is a project that the police in my area, in Hemel Hempstead, in a particular neighbourhood called Grove Hill, have been implementing as well. We're currently in the clear in the hold phase, and so therefore I wondered if you could share with this committee some reflections on the build phase, given that you're ahead of us, and some of the successes that you've had. And I also wanted to ask you to use this opportunity to reflect on the bill and how the measures in it will help with neighbourhood policing that's so central to these projects.
So the success of Clear Hole building in our areas is thanks to everybody. And I think that's a really important thing. It is everyone together, residents, they need to be part of that too, the community organisations, the police, the council. it very much is everybody. There is also ongoing clear. It's not a linear process of clear whole building, and we've certainly learned that. And I think, kind of as I've touched on through the comments I've made, that this bill and the provisions in it, some of it would have been very, very welcome. I know we've not talked about the exploitation of young people either, that this new provision, I think that, cuckooing, some of the respect order stuff, the CPNs, everywhere, public space protection, all of those things. We've been able to use bits of that locally, but this bill gives a framework that I think will enable councils to be able to deliver more, as long as there is the funding to do some of it. And I also, kind of you asking this, I think the collaborative approach needs to be across councils and across areas. We all learn from each other, and I think that's a major strength of the LGA, and also one that we're very happy to share with government, is you know yourselves, that learning across, and the need to support each other and to really deliver for all our residents is vital. Thank you.
A question, Alex Barnes-Curtis.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Just briefly going back to mandatory reporting, as I understand it, the reference to in section 45, subsection 2, to relevant police force or relevant local authorities directly from the ICSA set of inquiries. And I believe that's because typically, in terms of practice in England and Wales, it's because of the provision of children's social services. So, knowing it can be either or, but obviously we need to ensure that there is a kind of linkage between the two and that there is kind of cross-reporting. I just want to check that that isn't out of the norm of what, if a referral were made or a kind of a reference that were made at the moment, it would come into the local authority. So it doesn't add, putting this into law doesn't add an excessive burden on the local authorities from your respective positions.
Councillor Gerrard.
I expressed my concern earlier, it wasn't so much a burden on the local authority as much as wanting to expedite the process, that ultimately that disclosure is setting in motion. And so if the way to get there quicker is by going directly to the police, that would seem to make sense. But I would not argue to remove the ability to report to the council. If someone does do that, you would imagine that the council would be able to pass it on to the police.
I think again, final comment. Sorry, we can send more detail around this and look into it and sort of see how councils do it. I can speak from my own area that the way in which it's structured, we have a community safety team, a family services team, a relationship with the police, etc. So we are structured in a way that we have a very natural conversation and share, of trust across that. Again, I would note that a collaborative, proactive approach on the ground is vital to enabling that.
Thank you. Councillor Garrett, Councillor Conway, thank you very much indeed for your time. Committee again is indebted to you.
Thank you very much.
Next witnesses, please. Order. We shall now hear oral evidence from police and crime commissioners, including the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. We have until 4:50 p.m. for this panel. And I'm afraid we're having some difficulty in hearing this afternoon. It's not just me. I thought it was, but it isn't. So if you could speak as loudly and as clearly as you can muster, that would be appreciated. So, from left to right, would the panel please identify themselves for the benefit of the record?
Which left?
Sorry, camera left. Camera, that.
Roger Hurst, Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner for Essex and the APCC National Lead for Finance Joint.
Matthew Barber, Police and Crime Commissioner for Thames Valley and APCC Joint Lead for Violent Crime.
And Emily Sporrell, I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner for Merseyside, and I'm the Chair of the Association of PCCs.
That's excellent. We can hear you. Thank you very much indeed. Opposition from bench, Matt Vickers.
Yeah, so I've read the bill. Is there anything that concerns you? Is there anything that you think could be improved on? Is there any measures that you would like to see in the bill that don't currently feature?
So I suppose the first thing to say is there's a lot in here that we welcome. There's a lot in here that as PCCs we have been calling for a long time. So for example, the extra protection for retail workers, the recognition of they should not have to face assaults while doing their job, the sales of knives online and strengthening the ownership on businesses and sellers to crack down on that. Greater powers in relation to the ASB case review and achieving more consistency across the country, and the police appeals amendment as well, where we currently don't have the ability to appeal the outcome of the police tribunal. So there are lots in here that we welcome, and I think will go a long way to supporting some of the issues that we're facing locally. The one thing I would highlight, which will come as no surprise, and I imagine you've heard it from many others today, is about resource and capacity to be able to deliver on some of these issues. I think we welcome all of the actions. There's a lot in there to welcome. But as I say, I think there is some anxiety, particularly amongst police forces, to be able to actually meet the demand and not to kind of raise expectation of the public that because these powers now exist, that suddenly there will be a huge swathe of activity in that area, because it is all about resourcing and being able to deliver on the new activity.
Thank you. Matthew Barber.
Yes, I think a lot of the measures that are included in this bill were in the previous criminal justice bill, and I think a lot of that work is welcomed, and there is some consistency. Probably for me, a lot of the provisions probably fall into two categories. Some which are closing loopholes, certainly as far as the public are concerned, some really welcome moves around allowing the police the ability to enter premises without a search warrant where electronic devices with location detection is available. There's a huge frustration for the public where they've just expected the police to be able to do it and haven't understood that the current law prevents that. So there are some tidying up of those elements. There are some very welcome areas such as drug testing on arrest, which in Thames Valley the force have been rolling out one of the pilots. But that falls into the second category of those which will need significant resources, not just for police forces to provide the kits and the testing itself, but also for our local authority and health partners to provide the treatment that will come as a result of drug testing on arrest. And I think there's several measures in the bill that will require potentially significant resources going into it. One of those being around the monitoring of sexual offenders. Those on the sex offenders register, I think, again, some welcome moves expected by police forces, but that will put additional burdens in terms of resource on policing, and I think it would just be worth putting on record that note that police forces do an awful lot of work in protecting the public from predatory sex offenders, which often goes on behind the scenes, which isn't seen by the public, but is incredibly vital and needs to be properly resourced. One area potentially, if Parliament were inclined to go further around that, would be to allow the police to interrogate the digital devices of those on sex offenders register. At the moment, that only happens if there is a sexual harm prevention order in place specific to that offence. But given the proliferation of online grooming, the proliferation of the number of people on the sex offenders register, that additional power could be helpful in detecting other offences.
Thank you. Roger Hurst.
Thank you. Yes, in common with my colleagues, very much welcome the provisions that are in the bill. Would echo the comments made by Matthew around the additional costs related to drug testing on arrest, and would just perhaps bring to the committee's notice that there have been real problems with the industry providing the equipment for that. It is under-resourced at the moment. There is some investment that needs to be made, probably via us, into helping that industry develop, because at the moment we are not doing anything like as much as we would like to do, simply because of constraint of materials. So that is, it's probably single-digit millions, but it is a substantial amount of investment that needs to be made. I particularly welcome the provisions in there around making spiking a separate offence. That's certainly something which we in Essex are seeing in our nighttime economy as sadly a growing area, and somewhere where we need to be able to provide better protection. I think being able to point to it as an individual item, that would be a really powerful thing to be able to make some noise about and prevent it happening. And I think that plays into the overall governmental ambition to reduce violence against women and girls. I think there is an opportunity in this bill to pick up on some other items that we have been looking for quite a long length of time. We as PCCs, PFCCs are of course very much the victims' mouthpiece in our areas, and we are in contact with very many victims groups, and I consistently get feedback around the fact that victims would really very much like to have the provision in there for convicted offenders to attend their sentence hearing. There is a feeling of lack of justice when that does not happen, and the fact that they as victims are not seeing justice exercised in the way they would wish to. Also get the feedback that victims would very much like to see the mandatory life sentence for the worst categories of homicide. There are some homicides which are egregious enough to mean that it is fairly obvious that that person is unlikely ever to be able to be released without at least creating the risk of harm to the public. There's also, I think, the opportunity to deal with sexual offenders, following up on what Matthew said, bringing in a measure to ban sex offenders from changing their name. There is nervousness amongst the public that sexual offenders are not always known and are hard to track and can evade the monitoring which is supposed to be there for offender management. So to do that would be extremely welcome. Perhaps lastly, then also bringing in an offence of aggressive begging. We have that in our city centres in Essex. It can be very disruptive. Certainly get a lot of feedback from traders and town centre operators about the fact that aggressive begging in whether it be Southend, whether it be Colchester, whether it be Chelmsford, we certainly see the centre of town being disrupted.
And then probably in terms of resource, looking at sort of prolific offenders, those small number of people who commit huge volumes of crime, often low-level stuff, but do you think we can be doing anything more in that space to tackle that problem of those hyper-prolific offenders?
Emily Sparrow?
I think a big part of it for me is understanding what's driving their offending, and we see the greatest success when you invest in diversion and intervention. So we know there are prolific offenders, particularly in relation to retail crime, for example, where they are struggling with drug addiction, alcohol addiction, there might be mental health issues going on, there might be poverty in some cases, and I think we need to get much better and invest much more heavily, which lots of us as PCCs do already, but I think we need to do much more in that space if we had the resource to divert people away and put them onto the right intervention to stop those things that are driving their offending in the first place.
Yes, I would broadly agree. I think there was a huge amount, particularly around drug treatment and diversion that needs to be done for some of those prolific offenders. We also need to recognise there are those who operate in the organised crime space who are not necessarily the victims of drug abuse themselves, but the spreaders of that drug abuse. And I think there we do need to look at the sentencing and the other preventative orders that can be put in place. At a lower level, we have the criminal behaviour orders, which I'm pleased to see included as part of the retail element of this bill. But for a number of other prolific offenders who will seek to commit a wide variety of crimes, we need to be looking at both the sentencing, but also some of the provisions of this bill, which I do think actually help to bring those individuals to justice. So where at the moment they may well evade justice due to, for example, handling some of that electronic equipment in the pursuit of theft of vehicles, which at the moment is not an offence. To be procuring that and trading in it, that change in the legislation I think will help to tackle some of that organised crime element.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. Mr. Hurst?
Yes, similarly, I think one of the provisions here, which is very much to be welcomed, is doing away with that minimum £200 limit on shoplifting. So often these are prolific offenders. It is treated by the court system as a single offence and effectively a de minimis offence, when in actual fact, if you're doing that number of relatively small shoplifts in one day, you can be making quite a lot of money out of it. And to see that improvement is definitely positive. It does, of course, mean that we, I suppose, have to appeal to you, perhaps not in terms of this bill, but overall, to make sure that the criminal justice system is properly funded. There is undoubtedly an additional burden which will come out of this bill onto the criminal justice system. It's all well and good for us asking more resources for policing and for our PFCCs and PCCs, but it is really important that the criminal justice system gets to grips with its backlog. We are currently having cases listed in Essex for 2028. That is an extremely painful situation, and that can be for very serious crimes. So that needs to be worked through, please.
So in terms of off-road bikes, this is my last question, I promise. In terms of off-road bikes, I realise there's different areas affected very differently by the issues of antisocial use of off-road bikes and e-bikes, etc. My area is absolutely battered by the issue. The changes in this bill make changes specifically around the Police Reform Act and the ability to seize it without notice. There's obviously other powers there. But what more do you think can be done in that space, specifically around the ability to go into a private dwelling to seize one, particularly about what happens to these bikes actually when they're being seized by the police and then are sold online, sometimes the people who might have been making use of them in the first place. What do you think there's anything else we can do in that space to tackle the problem?
Mr. Barber.
Yes, so it's certainly an issue in Thames Valley, and I think the proposed change in legislation is welcome both for cars, where we see issues around antisocial behaviour of four-wheeled vehicles, but also around bikes. I think the changes to remove the warning is particularly useful about bikes, because we're talking about vehicles which are not always registered, and identifying an owner of those vehicles, therefore, to follow up on the warning is incredibly difficult. It's much easier with a four-wheeled vehicle, but even in those circumstances, again, the public generally expect the police to be taking action, and a warning that only lasts for a 12-month period, I think, is inadequate. I think following that seizure, I would be very supportive of the disposal of those vehicles, generally by crushing. That seems to be an effective deterrent for people to have their vehicles removed and crushed if they're using an antisocial fashion.
Sparrow?
Yes, I mean, I think I would echo what Matthew said. I think one of the challenges we have, depending on the vehicle, is when police officers are in pursuit or trying to stop these vehicles, so particularly with off-road scrambler bikes, so ones that have got proper engines. I think that can be a real challenge in terms of what powers or how comfortable the police are to try and follow and not actually end up creating further risk to the public or to the individuals on the bike. So I think that is a constant challenge. I'm not sure what the obvious answer is, but that is something that police forces do have to kind of contend with. The other bit, I think, around e-bikes in particular, and I don't know what the answer is, but whether there's more engagement that could happen with the companies, because we are seeing, certainly, again, speaking just in Merseyside, we are seeing organised criminal gangs use these because they are quieter than scrambler bikes, so easier to navigate around. They are able to adapt the speedometer or the kind of mechanism, which means they are going faster than they are being designed to go faster, which obviously is incredibly dangerous for them as well as the public around them. So anything that can be done to try and make that more difficult, I think, would help to try and keep them to the intention of what they were designed for.
Yes, thank you. I would differentiate between e-scooters and e-bikes. E-bikes seem, from the evidence that we have in Essex, to be like any other powered two-wheeler. I would simply be recommending there that they are treated like any other powered two-wheeler, and that they be registered with the registration numbers and the obligations to wear crash helmets, and they can be used on the roads in the same way that any other powered two-wheeler can be. There's a big difference, though, certainly for us, in terms of e-scooters. We very sadly had two young people on one e-scooter killed last month in Basildon, and they were a 9-year-old and a 15-year-old. Obviously ended their lives very sadly, ruined their families' lives, and ruined the lives of the people who hit them. It's very hard for us to see in Essex how e-scooters are compatible with our road system. I have to say that, having been to Bristol and seen how they work in the old Docklands there, I was very impressed with that, but we don't have anywhere like that in Essex. And it does appear that wasn't the first fatality that we've had others. We clearly have a situation where they are very risky vehicles, and very hard to see how they will ever be able to be used either on the road system or the footpath system. So from my perspective, either they're restricted to very small areas where they can be used safely, or we don't need them, because in terms of the deaths per travelled kilometre, they are very dangerous.
In terms of the power used to seize these bikes, so this one makes a change to the Police Reform Act. My understanding is that there's no actual nationally compiled figures of which powers are being used to seize bikes, and actually the Road Traffic Act is allowing many people to seize bikes without the notice set out here, and probably more quickly, easily and efficiently. Does your force use specifically police reform? Does it use the Road Traffic Act, or does it use an array of all of the above?
We use both. We use what we can, and we've crushed, I know, hundreds of e-scooters so far.
Thank you. Diana.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I'd like to ask about antisocial behaviour, and I'd like to particularly ask about the role that PCCs will take up within the provisions of this bill in terms of reviews that victims of antisocial behaviour can seek. And I just wondered, as a PC, all of you as PCCs, what your perspective on that is, and also how that might assist with your work around supporting victims.
Emily Spark.
So I think this is really welcome by all PCCs in terms of having some additional powers in relation to the ASB case review. Lots of us will already promote the fact that there is a appeal process where if people are unhappy with how their case has been reviewed, they can come to the our office and we will review that. The numbers are very low for that, and I think there is a real challenge in making sure the public is aware and victims are aware that this option is available to them. One of the other challenges that I know many of us face as well is that engagement we get with local authorities and the police and other partners who are doing that initial case review. And I think this bill gives an opportunity to have a bit more of a clearer, stronger role from the beginning so that we can have a real oversight as to how well those reviews are being conducted, how seriously are the voices of victims being heard as part of that, and also then creating that consistency across our region and hopefully across the country so victims don't end up in a two-tier system where some local authorities are saying, yes, we're going to take it and we're going to review it because it meets the threshold and other areas don't. So I think there's lots of benefits that us having a greater steer and a greater role in this will hopefully bring for victims.
Yes, I'd certainly welcome more involvement in this. It's something I tried to push with my local authorities a few years ago and got a bit of pushback because I have no statutory powers in this area, and I have 14 local authorities across Thames Valley. So it's a very a confused landscape for the public because the thresholds, local authorities can apply additional thresholds beyond the statutory simply to get into the case review system. They vary across the area. So actually our biggest challenge, normally the complaint I get is consistency across the whole policing area by the police. The problem I have here is consistency across local authorities. So I think having that ability to intervene in terms of the reviews is helpful because I think often for the public it's seen as local authorities or the police marking their own homework effectively. But I also think the most important thing we can do around antisocial behaviour is actually looking at the front door into it. And there's provisions in the bill for the Secretary of State to require data to be shared with the Home Office. But actually, I think the biggest issue is data sharing between local authorities and the police. In my view, there ought to be a single front door for reporting antisocial behaviour. The public often don't know whether something should be reported to the police or reported to the local authority. Sometimes it may well be both, depending on the nature of what's going on. And in reality, our constituents ought to feel they can just report something and the public bodies behind the scenes can sort out who's going to deal with the issue. That shouldn't be for the public to have to navigate the different bits of legislation. So certainly what I would like to see is better front-end reporting, and perhaps the provisions around data could ensure data being better shared between police and local authorities themselves.
I would absolutely agree with what my colleagues have just said, but would really ask if the provisions could actually go a little bit further. It would be really helpful if we as PCCs had the opportunity to require local authorities to act in these cases, because to be honest with you, the case reviews just haven't taken off in Essex. The powers are there now, but the public, you can be as loud as you like telling them about something that they don't want to use, and thankfully the number of cases where they might want to use it are relatively few. The local authorities do not promote it, and therefore we have vanishingly few of these case reviews in Essex at the moment. I'd like to have some ability to hold people to account for that.
Can I just make, just one additional quick comment. So on behalf of colleagues as well, while it's all very welcomed, I think if we are going to see an increase in these reviews, there is a real concern around the additional burden and again with the capacity of the OPCCs to deliver on some of this. I know, for example, in London with the Met, there's 34 local authority areas. That is a lot of case reviews that they potentially would have to deal with. So there is a real nervousness in lots of areas where they're going to suddenly see a big uptick in demand that I think would probably ask for additional support in making sure this works with the resource.
Accountability. So the bill also proposes changes to the IOPCC's referral threshold, and that may well result in fewer cases going forward to the CPS. And as PCCs, I just wondered what your view of that was, and whether you think that's going to actually be beneficial.
Yes, I think in light of some of the cases that have prompted these proposed changes, I would certainly support them. I think it's right that threshold is adjusted. I think that fits with what's right operationally. I think there are still adequate safeguards in place, but I think it's where the public and hopefully Parliament will expect that threshold to be. So I would support the changes.
Nope.
Could I just ask one last thing then, which is about also within the bill is the fact that the IOPC can send cases to the CPS before the IOPC have concluded all their work. Any view about that?
I personally would welcome that. I think we get a lot of feedback around the timeliness of reviews and how long the IOPC take to investigate, the impact that has on obviously the officers, but also the victims and people involved in it. And so I think anything that can speed up that process, and particularly early conversations with the CPS would speed up that process. I think that is very welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Sparrow, you talked about whether we talked about resources a lot or not, and we have, as it won't surprise you to learn. I wanted to just talk about neighbourhood policing resources specifically, if that was okay. In my local police force, we saw a 20% drop in PCSOs since 2023, and I know that my principal town of Frome has currently got vacancies with PCSOs. Do you have a view on whether or not some of the provisions in this bill, including very well-intentioned things like retail crime provisions, can actually be delivered with the neighbourhood policing that we currently have in place?
Well, I think, we are very honest about the fact that there are severe challenges within policing. It varies across different police forces, but we know that there are some forces that are facing significant financial deficits. I think the recent announcement on neighbourhood policing has absolutely helped with that. I think we very much welcome the additional 200 million that was announced by the government a few months ago. And lots of that is being used to invest in areas like PCSOs and putting that visible presence into areas, which I think will help with some of that. There has also been some flexibility around that, which because of the way the previous kind of uplift programme was run, it was very much ring fencing officers, which we value, and we know the public value that, but you then kind of end up in a very difficult position where forces are having to look at PCSOs and staff jobs to be able to balance the budget. So I think any flexibility that we can get around how the funding is given to police forces and through us, which means that you can then start to see PCSOs, for example, playing a more visible role, I think we're very welcome, and certainly that recent neighbourhood policing guarantee I think has helped with that.
Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my constituency in North East Derbyshire, we have real issues with car theft, and obviously in this bill we have a couple of clauses affecting signal jammers. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on how that will have a practical impact on preventing car theft.
So car theft has been growing across the country, but it's been particularly spectacular in Essex. We had one area of our county where it rose by 80% last year, which is dreadful. So jammers are undoubtedly a help. The technology is available to stop the passive entry system, but the criminals are very inventive. They are currently buying in quite expensive bits of kit from Poland, which they can bring in legally. We really do need, as Mr. Barber said earlier, we really do need to have the legislation to mean that actually owning those things is a crime. They are only good for one purpose. At the moment, buying them is perfectly legal. Using them is a crime. Having them should be illegal as well. I have been to see Jaguar Land Rover myself to talk to them because they were one of the companies particularly hard hit by theft in our area. Essex, I think, has a good reputation for being good buyers of Range Rovers. They responded very well and committed to retrofitting security to their vehicles to change the risks of passive vehicle entry, which is basically where you have a key you don't have to press a button on, where there's a dialogue in signal between your vehicle and your key, which is possible for a criminal to read very easily because there's no single instance where you're pressing the button. They've made that much more difficult to intercept. And to have the equipment that could do that band as well would be really helpful. At the moment it's freely available, not freely available, you have to pay for it, but it's very readily available over the internet. It is possible for the car manufacturers to make that more difficult. I think they're always working on it. They are, however, always going to have to run ahead of the inventiveness of the criminal. So whatever can be done in terms of making the ownership of the bits of equipment that criminals need to own to be able to break into vehicles that easily would be extremely helpful.
Yes, just to add to that, I think what's going to be key here is the secondary legislation from memory. I think it's Clause 78 or 79, which allows the Secretary of State to make additional secondary legislation, and that will be critical, I think, in years to come, because as Mr. Hurst just said, that technology is constantly changing. So a definition in legislation now around signal jammers will no doubt be out of date, possibly before the bill's even got royal assent. So what will be critical is for the Home Office to keep that list of prohibited equipment under review.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I just want to reflect quickly on knife crime and the provisions in the bill. Firstly, your comments on the clause to make it offence to have to possess with the intent to cause unlawful violence, whether you think sort of on practically that's workable and how it would be enforced, but also more generally on knife crime. What either in your areas have you seen as being particularly good, bad and different in terms of tackling it, and if there's anything in particular missing from the bill? Yeah, start with Matthew. Thank you.
Yes, so I think an awful lot of focus in legislation goes on the type of knife being used, the talk about zombie knives, etc. And whilst I wouldn't oppose that legislation that's been put in place to prohibit the use or the ownership of those weapons, the reality is the vast majority of knife-enabled incidents, whether that's robbery, theft, injury, are caused by kitchen knives, something that we cannot realistically outlaw in our society. So it definitely comes, I think the use of intent and the ability to seize within private dwellings, I think, is really important, because the police may well be dealing with a suspect for an unrelated offence around drug possession, for example, and while they're in that property, they may see a stash of knives clearly likely to be used for criminal purposes, not for someone cutting their salad, and yet they would currently be powerless to do anything about that because they're being legally held in private premises. So I think this is one of those things I would put into that category of tying up some of the loopholes in legislation, which won't actually cost policing anything. We have police officers in situations at the moment where they cannot use current legislation to protect the public, and more broadly, where we've seen success certainly in Thames Valley and across the country where it's been done, that focus on possession of knives is absolutely vital. So good use of stop and search, and making sure that we're focusing not just on those people who are already committing the dangerous offences of robbery and assaults, but actually making sure we're getting the knives off the streets in the first place, recognising that possession itself is critical to enabling others to commit further offences.
Yes, I would very much agree with that. I think it's always been a difficult area, but I've never really understood why the previous legislation, and perhaps this legislation therefore, cannot simply ban all bladed instruments which do not have a legitimate use in the environment in which they are found. And we had a machete battle on Southend seafront last summer, which was extraordinary. Yeah, none of those young people had any reason to be carrying a 2-foot bladed instrument. In fact, why on earth were they allowed to buy them in the first place? Yeah, the provisions around purchase over the internet need to be enforceable. We really need to have it to be the case that they have to produce ID when they order it, and produce ID when it's delivered to prove that they are over 18. But also, why are things like that available over the internet at all? Having talked to agricultural and nature groups, there's nothing that you can do with a machete that you can't do with a billhook. You're not going to take a billhook to a battle. So why not just ban them, please? That would really help. And I think there's also something about the provisions of the bill as it is at the moment, where effectively the defence of saying I'm only carrying it for self-defence would effectively still work, because the way it's phrased at the moment, the implication is that you're going out with intent to cause harm. I think if you're carrying it for self-defence, you are prepared to use it. And perhaps you need to, I would ask if the legal brains could actually think about a way of phrasing it to mean that the plea of I'm only carrying it to defend myself is equally an offence, because that is something you can carry into a street fight.
So on Merseyside, notwithstanding we've obviously seen some really tragic incidents, we've actually seen knife crime going down. We've seen about a 7% reduction in serious violence and particularly knife crime incidents. And I think there are two reasons for that. I think there has been a huge amount of proactivity. We were the first force to pilot serious violence reduction orders, which I think have made a difference in terms of identifying those individuals who are routinely carrying knives and who are routinely posing the threat that has been described. And I think that's been helpful to, I suppose, monitor the previous question around prolific offenders. We have seen some good success with that. But then the flip side of that is also obviously the public education and the engagement, particularly with young people piece, the work we do with knife savers around the dangers of carrying a knife, the fact that you are more likely to be a victim of a stabbing if you carry a knife yourself, even if you are doing it for protection. The work we have done through our violence reduction partnership to really understand and educate young people about how they can get into that situation and what the alternatives are. There is a huge amount of work of education and prevention which I think has got to go hand in hand with all the enforcement activity as well.
Bishop.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Just briefly like to touch on the police appeals tribunal. Police and crime commissioners such as yourselves up and down the country represent the public in holding forces and chief constables to account. And in the context of public confidence in policing, how important is it that PCCs have an equivalent right of appeal to the police appeals tribunal?
Well, I think very important. I think it was a gap. I think it was something that was missed in previous legislation. So this, in our view, seeks to just correct an error. We are, as you say, responsible for holding Chief Constable to account. We are very focused on improving that trust and confidence that the public have in the police. And so rather than having to go through a lengthy judicial review process, having that right of appeal to make sure that those standards are being met if we feel they have not been, I think is very important.
David Bird-Sampson.
Thank you, Sir Roger. This is obviously a meaty bill. There's lots of really good stuff in here, and much of it will give new powers to existing police officers, people across the force, and to local authorities. Now, as PFCCs or PCCs, you'll have a key role in helping to make sure the new laws are implemented, assuming this passes through Parliament. How confident do you feel in making sure that that happens? Because it's pointless passing laws if they aren't implemented on the ground.
I think this goes back to the point that was raised earlier about do we have the resources. So I think really welcome the government's commitment to the 13,000 additional people in neighbourhood policing. The really vital thing is that we do have the funding both to sustain the current workforce and to build the workforce in the way you would like to see us do it. There's a real challenge there because police has expanded by 20,000 over the last 6 years. Those police officers will all be going through the police contractual incremental pay scales as they go through. The big jump is when they hit 5 and 6 years. And that is going to be a big boost to police pay at that point without us recruiting any more people. So to be able to do what we need to do with this bill, we will need the resources that we have and the resources which are heading down the track towards us, we believe, and we're very grateful for. But it's actually the funding of the existing workforce which I think is the real challenge. And that in itself is probably going to cost some £300 million a year.
I would completely agree. I think a lot of it comes down to the money, but I think the only additional point I would make is about the reliance on other partners in this. So as we awaited our session, there was conversation about fly tipping, certainly an issue that exercises the police. But at the moment, the responsibility lies with local authorities. The bill only proposes some guidance rather than any duties on local authorities to clear up the waste or investigate where currently they have powers but aren't obliged to use them. Around some of the wider antisocial behaviour provisions, as I mentioned in response to the Minister, there is a huge reliance on local authorities to play their part, both in terms of sharing information around reporting, but also an exercise of powers. where many of the solutions to antisocial behaviour issues in our communities do not lie within the police remit. They will actually be to do with provisions of housing from social landlords, with powers that local authorities have got, and we need to work collectively. So I'm confident that policing, given the right resources, can deliver the things that are in this bill, but I think what's really key is making sure that all those other partners are able to assist in that, because many of these provisions cannot be delivered by policing on their own.
One question, Alex Barras-Curtis.
Sorry, can I just add very quickly? Just to add to that as well, I think it's not just about policing and the partners that Matthew's outlined, but also criminal justice as well, because we know more officers, more PSSOs, more going through the system is going to create even more pressure on an already struggling courts, prison system. So I think we need to be very mindful of the whole kind of criminal justice approach to it.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Just returning briefly to police accountability, and you've already expressed support for what the Minister said about amending some of the restrictions in terms of the kind of thresholds for referral and whether or not a final investigation has been completed. In respect of the IOPC's kind of victims' right to review, placing that on a statutory footing, presumably that's something you would support in terms of building public confidence in the IOPC and what they're there to do in terms of accountability of the police forces in our country.
So I think I would say that the system does not work very well for victims at all at the minute. The language used, the way that we approach it is very, bureaucratic. And so I think anything that can empower victims and make sure they feel like they are being heard and that they have a right to have their concerns addressed, I think is very welcome.
Yes, agree.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think actually making it more accessible would be, as you say, using better language, but also shorter time frames is really important.
I completely agree.
Gentlemen, lady, thank you very much indeed for your time and for your expertise. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Order. We now hear oral evidence from Dr. Lawrence Newport. We have until 5:05 for this witness. Dr. Newport, could you identify yourself briefly for the record, please?
Dr. Lawrence Newport, I run the cross-crime campaign.
Thank you very much indeed. Shadow Minister.
Thank you. Having read the bill, is there anything that concerns you, anything you think we could improve, or any measures you'd like to see in the bill that don't currently feature in it?
I think there's several points that might be helpful to bring up in broad terms. I think one of the chief issues since starting the campaign a few months ago that I've heard from police is there's a bunch of barriers to things they're trying to do. They find it several of them have described it as becoming more and more difficult to just kind of do the basics of their job. I think the more that things can be streamlined and the more that it's clear to the public what's going on, the better. Some of these aspects are things like I think there should be a national database for homeowners to... Many of us have CCTV on our houses, or at least ring cameras and so forth. I think an opt-in national database where people could be paid a nominal fee of some amount maybe annually or something like this, where they could upload their footage, so that at the moment officers are going door to door to collect footage when something happens. On Christmas, near my house, somebody had their, actually the whole road had their tyres slashed, and the police had to go around and try to get footage from everyone's ring cameras individually. This obviously takes a lot of time, and on something like Christmas Day, there's not many police around, so things become very complex, take a long period. If there was a national database, I'm sure many homeowners like myself would simply upload the footage, and it would be there, and they could just download it straight away. Connected to this also would be an ability for homeowners to, at the moment, sometimes they require a planning permission to mount CCTV on their home in case it oversees a public area. If there were exemptions to this, I think we would also see a lot of neighbourhood policing become a lot easier, a lot of burglaries easier to solve, and actually a lot of petty crime easier to solve as well. If people are getting attacked in alleyways, then you can easily get a hold of footage that otherwise might be very, very difficult. That's just on the CCTV side. There is also things like I've heard a lot of complaints from officers about their computer systems, both the old systems being very, very difficult to use, taking a lot of time, crashing frequently, and some of the newer systems. I know the Met system, there's been a lot of complaints that I've heard from officers that they found this extremely difficult, that it breaks all the time. There is some evidence as well that it looks like arrests dropped significantly with the introduction of the new system with the Met, but it's been very difficult to get any information on that. Freedom of information requests are not being successful, and in fact, Chris Philp asked in Parliament about it and did not get an answer either. I think some clause to make it much more transparent about procurement and more transparent about the effects of different systems would go a long way to helping the public know what's actually going on inside. And I think also help the police in terms of explaining to the public why there are so many problems and why things are, for instance, so many amounts of crime just simply falling through the net.
You obviously did a very good job of illustrating the need for the ability to enter a house without a warrant. In terms of that, obviously it's been drafted in this bill more narrowly than was in the previous bill. Do you think it will still fulfil the need it aims to?
I certainly support it. I would say that previous wording was encouraging. It is good to see that it is happening now. I would prefer it to go much further. There is an epidemic of phone theft. There is an epidemic in snatch thefts in general. It is something which we now have better and better technology. And the technology, of course, will only get better and will only get better at speed and cheaper. Given this, we should be able to actually use this information. It is also the case that the longer we wait for this and the more difficult we make this, the more detailed these pipelines are becoming. My sister-in-law's phone was stolen actually 2 weeks after I launched the campaign, and only a week after the bike theft video that I did outside the Met, and her phone within a week was in China. These are very, very established networks. There's obviously a massive industry happening, and that has been allowed to take hold. So we do need police to have as best powers as they possibly can, whilst obviously keeping this in line with people's expectations to their own home life, etc. But yes, I did support the previous wording and would like the government to go as far as they can on this, yes.
And then in terms of the approach to hyper-prolific offenders and what we do and how we ensure that they're properly sanctioned, do you have any views on that, on how we could move that forward in that space?
Yes, I think there should be in the bill provision that the more offences committed, particularly for career criminals, these are people with 15 offences to their name, previous offences to their name, the more offences someone has committed, the longer they should spend in prison for their current offence. This is technically the current guidelines, but there are a lot of exemptions in the current guidelines in the way they are drafted by the Sentencing Council. This should be put into statute, that this is a direct, clear statement that the Sentencing Council should follow and should make sure it's super clear to judges.
Dame Diana.
If I could just ask you more generally around antisocial behaviour and some of the provisions within the bill, particularly around respect orders. Do you support what respect orders could help deliver in terms of tackling antisocial behaviour in our communities?
I think my view on this is closer to trying to make sure before people get to a point of 15 or more offences, before they kind of get to this period where they are career criminals or hyper-prolific offenders, I support a ream of measures before that, so you don't... early intervention is, of course, the absolute key. If you can get people before they enter that point, I support all measures that try to do this as fast as possible. This means tagging and other such measures as well. I support so long as the building doesn't support them, but I do, because we do have very good evidence that the earlier you intervene, but it's not just early intervention, of course, it's actually the speed of that intervention. So making sure as well, in statute, that they are seen in a courtroom very soon after their first or second or third offence would mean that we would see meaningful change and would see people not enter the kind of career criminal pathway, which once they have, we of course need to imprison them for longer periods.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Newport, I do apologise for the lighting effects.
It's okay, it's stadium lighting, I like it.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Sir Roger. I was just wanting to ask you about respect orders and that they're being pitched at the moment to come in at age 18 and over. What would your view be on reducing that age to 16, whatever level you think might be another level, or do you think 18 is pitched about right, given them how much antisocial behaviour is by juveniles?
Dr. Newport.
I think that there's good reason to consider it for 16 and above. I think this is because a lot of, exactly as you said, a lot of antisocial behaviour does happen at 16, 17. Actually, so does quite a bit of crime as well. So I think there's good reason to at least look at the impact of doing so. And if that would help prevent people from going down the pathway to becoming career criminals, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Dr. Newport, for your evidence. I wanted to just look back to something that you said at the beginning of your remarks about encouraging citizens to use CCTV in their homes to better allow the police to prosecute crimes. One issue that kind of does recur is that even when CCTV is available in people's homes and they say to the police, look, I've got this here for you to be able to use to catch who perpetrated this burglary or whatever else, the CCTV is not always used in that instance in the way in which they would like, and I wondered if you could speak to that. And I think there's also a bit of a regional inequality point where in my part of Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, in York, for example, they have live access to CCTV, which can be really important in allowing people to deal with crimes in the moment as they find them and also to direct police forces into the right spot. In Selby, our CCTV looks like it comes out of the 1970s. It's too blurry and grainy to use half the time, and it poses major challenges for the police. And I just wondered if you could kind of point to how those practical realities affect your earlier remarks.
Dr. Newport.
So I think, one, yes, there is... I think it's actually why home CCTV is so useful. Cameras now are so much, vastly cheaper than they were even 20 years ago when a lot of this infrastructure was put in place. You can get HD cameras now on your doorbell in a way that 20 years ago would have been obscenely expensive to do. So I think being able to allow homeowners, for the price of £30 for one of these cameras, they could probably outcompete in a lot of ways what is the actual national infrastructure otherwise that was put in a long time ago. I completely agree that in fact it's extremely frustrating that a lot of the time, even when there is CCTV, that it is not being looked at or used. There are several, I think, ways of, shall we say, encouraging this, making this easier. One of them is, I think there should be clauses for procurement on artificial intelligence systems that can scan these. This is actually extremely likely to be something that, in fact, current systems can do it. Future systems will certainly be able to do this. Give it indications of what you're looking for, and it can highlight it to officers within seconds. We should have this. The fact that that isn't used at all is astounding. I think it's also the case that ensuring that officers have training so that they are looking at footage in the most time-efficient way. For instance, looking at 50 binary searches where rather than viewing the whole footage on fast forward to see the incident, if, for instance, you're looking for something like a bike missing, you are watching the bike, you check in halfway through the footage, is it there or not? If it is, then you check into 75%, is it there or not? And you keep doing this in halves. You can do an extremely fast search. It might take you minutes when otherwise it will take you hours to go through footage. And I think some officers are still going through hours and hours and hours of footage rather than simply using methods we know work extremely well.
Joe Robertson.
Thank you, Chair. Clearly, solving a set of issues in a given day, so the bill we're looking at in front of us, depends on well-worded law that is targeted at the problem it's trying to solve. But I just invite you to maybe share your views on backing it up with the appropriate resources, be it money, be it technology, for the police to be able to deliver on the law. I think over the last long time, decades, we've seen more and more criminal law come into being without necessarily the resource to back it up. And I just invite you to sort of comment on that interplay between well-worded law and the resources for police to be able to act on it.
I think, and I think on the resources point, it is both the fact that, of course, like I was, some of my ideas here have been around CCTV, procurement, AI. I think these things would all help reduce police time and costs, and also making sure the public can see the effects of these things, that they are actually transparent, that we are actually able to check on them, which at the moment we don't seem to be able to do so. The fact that I have to try to ask an MP to ask a question in Parliament about the Connect system, and I still can't get a response, there is still no way of checking, is completely and utterly unacceptable. But I also think it is the case that the British public, on survey after survey, puts healthcare as the thing that they want to see the most funding to, and second and third is joint between education and criminal justice. And I think government funding is nowhere near the public's priorities on this, and that's what I would point to on the funding question.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Dr. Newport, thank you very much indeed for finding the time to come and talk to us.
Thank you so much.
Grateful to you for your evidence.
Thank you.
Next witness, please. Order. We now hear oral evidence from the National Farmers Union of England and Wales, and we have until 5:20 for this witness. Could you please identify yourself for the sake of the record?
Yes, certainly. Sam Durham. I'm the Chief Advisor for Land Management at the National Farmers Union.
Good afternoon, Mr. Durham. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Opposition front bench, please.
Having read the bill, is there anything that concerns you, anything you would seek for us to improve, or are there any measures that you'd like to see in the bill that aren't currently in it?
I think from our point of view, I lead on rural crime for the National Farmers Union, and we're quite keen that the bill is rural proofed, so rural communities get the benefit from these changes as much as possible. From our quick view of the bill, the areas we're particularly interested in is fly tipping. That really blights rural communities and private landowners, and currently we feel there's a gap in local authorities addressing that. Some work very effectively on that, others rely on the police, and others rely on other government agencies, and we find that for a landowner with a fly tipping incident, it's not clear from them how that gets dealt with, and it is a bit of a lottery across the country about how that is dealt with. So the improvements on guidance in the bill is to be welcomed, and we welcome that side of the legislation. As was mentioned by the previous speaker, the ability to search without a warrant for electronic goods, we feel that could have benefit for agricultural theft as well, because we encourage our members, wherever possible, to fit tracking devices to their vehicles and machinery. And talking to some of the National Police Chiefs leads I have contact with, they would welcome that ability to track a stolen tractor or a stolen quad bike, and then enter the premises where they believe it to be. So although I know that the legislation is focused more towards phone theft, we think that there could be the added benefit in addressing equipment theft as well. And we welcome the government pushing for secondary legislation on the Equipment Theft Act as well, which should help that side as well. And I think finally, one thing that my members mention me quite a lot is on the offensive weapons side. Members deal quite a lot with poaching and other incidents on farm. And one trend, unfortunate trend, we've experienced in various parts of the country is the use of catapults, and the use of catapults to kill wildlife, but also farm animals, also cause criminal damage, damage to tractor windows and the like. So it would be interesting to address whether catapults could be added to the list of offensive weapons, because we feel that a criminal element are using them now because if caught in possession, it's not so easy for the police to push a prosecution through. So that's really what we welcome in the bill so far.
And then in terms of fly tipping, obviously we've seen the penalties, the financial penalties for that go up. We're now seeing changes to guidance coming in. Is there anything else you think we could be doing in that space? One particular thing that was suggested before was around those responsible for fly tipping incurring points on their driving licence. Is there anything else you think we can do in that space? What do you think of that proposal?
I mean, I think there are measures. We've worked quite closely with the police and government on hair coursing legislation, which allows the seizure of items that are used. So in hair coursing incidents, it's the dogs, which are a valuable asset, and the vehicles. So yeah, certainly those kind of measures could act as a further deterrent. But I think from our point of view, or a landowner's point of view, it's that key issue of whose responsibility is it, which authority, and I think it's clear it should be the local authority. Police find they are having to address it, and I know police and crime commissioners see it as a priority, but that does cause confusion on the ground for the landowner about who deals with it and what happens once you've got an incident. Because once the tipped rubbish is there, it's the landowner's responsibility to clear it up.
And then there's measures in the bill around the seizure of vehicles that are used antisocially. Do you have any views on that, or anything else you think should be done in that space?
Again, I think that works as a good deterrent in some rural criminality. So yeah, we would support those kind of issues, and we do look at food security issues as well, and illegal import of meat, etc. And I know our president is keen on investigating whether there is potential to seize and crush those vehicles as a deterrent measure.
Yep.
Okay, Madam.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you, Mr. Durham, for coming to give evidence today. Rural crime absolutely blights communities across my rural North Yorkshire constituency, and I do think a lot of the measures in the bill, whether that is to help deal with off-road bikes, with the theft of equipment from farm vehicles, with fly tipping, is going to make a difference. However, the substance of the law matters in its application, and a big challenge that we have in the Selby district is cross-border crime, where criminals will perpetrate some of these acts on one side of a border and slip across to South or West Yorkshire and evade detection by the police. Does the NFU have a view on how we can take some of these provisions but make sure that they're operationalised in a way that is cross-border to make sure that these criminals are kind of taken to justice?
Certainly, I think we, for a long time, while we've been working on crime, we've always pushed that coordination and consistency is the key. And certainly my members on any county or police force boundary will say they have the issues you mentioned, that a criminal will know that they will get treated differently in one force area compared to the other, and they can and stolen equipment can be taken across border, and there's less chance of investigation and taking action. We welcome some of the work the National Police Chiefs Council are doing now, bringing the National Rural Crime Unit together, and Home Office have now funded that unit for the next 3 years, which is positive news. And that information sharing best practice, and linking forces together is key, I believe. And I think we'd see it. There is also a challenge for government to work across government departments. I was at the National Rural Crime Network conference on Tuesday, where DEFRA and Home Office were there. But I think there are government departments, for instance, with fly tipping and MHCLG, where other departments can work together more at a national level and filter that down to working more together on the local level.
Thank you. Thank you,
Chair. Chair, I represent Rumini, Somerset, which has a large number of NFU members and farmers who I meet a lot. One of the things they tell me very frequently is that they don't actually bother reporting rural crime because they just don't think there's any value in doing so, or that it will ever be resolved, which massively frustrates the local rural crime PCSO because she never gets the intelligence she needs about what's happening. I wondered from an NFU point of view whether you feel there's enough in this bill on rural crime to reassure farmers that the government is taking their concerns seriously, and if they report rural crime, something's going to be done about it.
I think not necessarily in the bill, and I think it is all linked to funding and fair allocation of police funding as well. A lot of rural forces I speak to, including Avon and Somerset and Lincolnshire and the others, will say how the funding they receive from central government doesn't necessarily reflect the the operational issues they have with remote rural areas, input of tourists, and vulnerable communities, which it takes a long time to get to them. But then we do challenge our membership to report crime. I think there is a culture in farming to just get on with it, and if your fence is damaged, you repair it yourself. It isn't worth reporting. But we have sent that message out, and working with the police as well, to say you do need to report it, because that there's no way you can increase police support or police funding without that understanding of how much crime is occurring in rural areas. And we work with other agencies who say that a lot of that crime is potentially linked to organised criminal networks as well. So building that picture, the reporting aspect is an important part of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Farmers tell me in my constituency in North East Derbyshire that they have a frustrating issue with off-road bikes often being used across their land. Do you think that this bill goes far enough with the new powers to seize those vehicles?
I think it does. I think that power to seize vehicles that are being used in an antisocial manner is key, and that in some areas, mainly urban. I mean, we think of farming in rural areas, but actually that urban fringe area is key to where vehicles are used, either bikes or quad bikes, or even off-road vehicles are used in an antisocial manner. And many farmers do flag that to me, that there are people out there, and the measures in this bill do look positive on that side.
Thank you, Roger. Missing from the bill is anything to do with livestock theft or worrying. Do you consider that those are covered sufficiently in legislation elsewhere, or is there anything you'd like to see included in this to recognise that for farmers, for rural landowners, that is a huge issue? And I mean, not in any way to diminish theft from a shop, but the value of a cow or a sheep is significant. And should this, do you think, be represented more in this bill?
I think on the livestock worrying issue, there's a private member's bill progressing at the moment, which I believe government have said they would support, the Dogs Protection of Livestock Amendment Bill, and a lot of the measures there have appeared at other times in legislation and then been dropped. But we've worked quite closely with the National Police Chiefs Council and others, including RSPCA and Kennel Club, and a lot of those measures we would support and give the police more powers to investigate, seize dogs, and take samples to link attacked animals with the dogs. So I think that legislation, if it can progresses, covers that issue. Livestock theft is a complicated issue because you have to have the skills to handle livestock to steal livestock, but it is also a concern because there are routes for livestock to enter the food chain, and if animals are being stolen and processed in a different way, there's potential food hygiene issues, etc. I think the picture around livestock theft isn't clear at the moment, and we support the National Rural Crime Unit now have a livestock theft coordinator who is doing a lot of research into how livestock theft is recorded by the police, because at the moment it isn't a clear picture in each force how it's recorded. So there isn't a national picture on what livestock theft looks like, and how again we have the issue of how it's reported and how our farming members report that crime. So I think potentially that there aren't measures in this bill around livestock theft, but I think potentially coming out the results of the research that the National Rural Crime Unit are doing, there could be scope for future legislation on livestock theft in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yes.
Thank you
for
indulging me. One question I did just want to ask was around the confidence that you feel individual farmers might have in these measures, because I think we're in an unenviable situation at the moment where farmers in my constituency deal with criminality frequently and sort of have to step up themselves and put themselves in danger. I was speaking to a farmer in Brotherton the other month who had kind of chased a gang of people on these off-road bikes across his farm, putting himself at kind of personal risk and danger. Do you think that if implemented correctly, these measures will provide individual farmers with the reassurance that they're not going to have to put themselves in similar danger in the future?
I hope so, yeah. I mean, I think in general, the rural community and farmers will have a good relationship with the police, and they recognise the challenges police have with low numbers. But where forces have a rural crime team, they do build that link with the local community and with the farming community. And what I will hear when I go to meetings around the country is rural crime is a big issue. But they support the police. They just want to give the police the tools to deal with the criminality they're having to deal with themselves. And I think certainly that link to organised criminality is worth investigating as well, that actually it may seem a low-level crime to steal a quad bike from a farm, but actually it's potentially funding bigger networks. And on the waste crime, on the fly tipping side, that is waste crime issues. There is evidence that that's linked to organised criminal activity as well. So I think putting the picture together, but I think farmers will be reassured, to answer your question, a long answer, but farmers will be reassured that the government is taking this issue seriously, and alongside with some of the other legislation on equipment theft and livestock worrying, it's showing that rural crime is being taken seriously, I think.
Thank you.
Final question, Gerrard.
If I could take you back to fly tipping very quickly. We've heard previously today how obviously it's a problem for local authorities, but they're clearly more resourced than private landowners who often end up being owning the site where rubbish is dumped. Is there anything you can see, any opportunity missed here in the bill to try and tackle fly tipping, particularly for people who, through no fault of their own, have this dumped on their private property?
I mean, I think the guidance to local authorities is key, and there are some really good examples of where local authorities are bringing all the agencies together, whether that's Environment Agency, police, and having a coordinated approach to tipping. So it means that then members of the public know who to go to when they see an incident. But I think there isn't a general approach to that across the country. So if there's any way of legislating that approach or within the local authority guidance to make that happen would be key. And for the landowner or the victim, the landowner themselves, it's knowing where to report, so having a single reporting mechanism that gets to the right people, because they can't view a tip and say that's hazardous waste, that's the Environment Agency's responsibility, that's the local authority's responsibility, or that's just rubbish thrown out of the back of a car. They can't judge that. If there's a single reporting system that allows them to log it and then that finds the right person to deal with it, is one thing we would be campaigning for as well.
Mr Durham, thank you for joining us and for so ably expressing the concerns of the National Farmers Union of England and Wales. We're most grateful to you.
Thank you.
Next witness, please. Order. We'll now hear oral evidence from the group Stand With Hong Kong. We have until 5:35 for this witness, and could you please identify yourself for the sake of the record?
Right. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. I speak today in both of my capacity as a Hong Kong-born refugee in the UK and representing Stand With Hong Kong, a 100% grassroots, independent and crowd-funded advocacy group that runs the Secretariat of the APPG on Hong Kong.
Thank you, Monsieur. Opposition front bench. Sharon,
the bill, is there anything that concerns you that you think could improve, or are there any measures you'd like to see in the bill that don't currently exist in the bill?
Yes, I would like to draw the committee's attention to grave risks posed by the public order clauses, and this be particularly those that would criminalise the act of concealing one's identity at protests. For many Hong Kongers in the community, face coverings at protests are not a matter of convenience or anonymity. They're a matter of safety, a shield against foreign repression. This is not theoretical. This is already happening in our country. So as you guys may know, for the past few years, national security law in Hong Kong and Article 23 has created a climate of fear, and as extraterritorial reach means, even actions taken in the UK can result in repercussions thousands of miles away. Even community groups that meet privately with parliamentarians often ask not to be photographed or named publicly for the fear of being identified by foreign state actors. So at anti-CCP protests, which often take place in the UK, it's very common for participants to be photographed by pro-Beijing individuals, as mentioned in the report by the Intelligence and Security Committee in 2023. These images are often passed back to Hong Kong or Chinese authorities or circulated in Chinese on Chinese platforms such as WeChat group chats or Weibo. As a result, most of these protesters, there are much presence that they have been doxxed, and their family back home have been visited or harassed by the police force there. It's a very common tactic deployed by the authoritarian regimes to silence dissidents and mobilize every of its members in the overseas diaspora to monitor fellow members in the diaspora to silence dissidents and minimize any democratic voices, dissenting voices in its overseas diasporas. So the press has also documented multiple cases of Hong Kong protesters and Chinese international students being reported by their peers for attending peaceful protests in the UK.
Ms. Young?
Yes.
I certainly don't wish to be discourteous, and neither do I wish to in any way make light of the very real concerns that you're expressing. But could I ask you to relate very specifically to the question that was asked, which is,
yes,
how can this bill be improved or amended to address some of the issues that are of concern to you, please?
If this bill is passed in its current form, it will criminalize the very safety precaution many in our community must take to avoid identification. I think the cause of making criminalized considering identity at protests should be taken away in this bill.
And so in terms of the challenge for the government, obviously a huge amount of money is spent managing protests in this country. I think in London we spent around £53 million managing pro-Palestinian protests. Some of the measures are designed to aid the police in managing those protests and actually protecting the public from people who would do them harm. How do you think we can best balance that need to allow peaceful protests with the need to also prevent disruption and prevent those people who would use the face covering to prevent being detained by the police?
Ms. Young?
That's an interesting question. I can only speak for the experience of anti-CCP protests, which most of them are very peaceful and often not resulting in any kind of arrest. I think for protests to balance the needs of public order, police could always communicate with the protest organisers ahead of the protests and to improve their relationship with these community leaders to see how they can facilitate a peaceful protest to be carried out instead of deploying these measures that inadvertently assist authoritarian repression.
Figures? No? Done. Diana Johnson.
Thank you.
So,
thank you. I listened very carefully to what you've said, and obviously I'm very concerned about what you've said as well. But I just wanted to highlight that the provisions in the bill, and it's specifically clauses 86 to 88, yes, they don't apply to all protests. So this isn't a blanket that you can't hide your face at a protest. It's only designed for those purposes where a senior police officer reasonably believes that a protest is likely to involve or has involved the commission of criminal offences. So I wondered, having sort of set that out to you, do you have a different view then about that clause?
It's a complex issue here, but I will try to summarise my view. So the power is devolved into the police hands to decide whether criminal offences will take place in the protests. And the recent Chinese embassy protests, where there are like over 20 police cars and over 6,000 protesters joined, there are crashes between organisers and police where disproportionate amount of police power were designated in the protests that for context is a lot of Hong Kongers who recently settled here might not understand English perfectly, so that might lead to misunderstanding in terms of police instructions. If there are more police powers given to, in this case, it would easily lead to an abuse of power when, especially when the police doesn't really understand the nuances of it. I believe there is a letter that is addressed to the Met Police of its disproportionate measures applied to the community protests, the Hong Kong and repressed Chinese community protests, drafted by Tom Tugendhat MP and Sir Ian Duncan Smith.
But you accept that we are a rules-based country, we have the rule of law, and there are checks and balances on the police. So that's why we're very specific in what this clause says in terms of it's not a blanket that you cannot, if you feel that you've got to hide your face, but it's only if there's going to be the commission or a police officer, senior police officer believes there's going to be the commission of offences.
Ms. Young?
That's a very good question here. I think the government can try to clarify with in the provisions where suspicion of crime, to clarify what suspicion of crime here it is. I clearly understand the proportionate needs of laying out clear rules, but sometimes most of these criminal offences are quite broadly defined. For example, like last time when the protest is organised, the police ordered protesters only to stay in a very small area, which outside of the area, if you stand outside of the area, you can get arrested. And which is also linked to another offence as the blockade of the highway. But I moved the community to understand it is a very easily reached threshold of the criminal offence or suspicion. So I think there is a need for the government to balance that, especially when it comes to protest-related laws.
Okay. Just to be clear, are you saying that you shouldn't be able to stop someone covering their face at any protest? Is that your position?
My position is if there are very obvious criminal intent here, which the government who needs to clarify. In this very broadly defined offence. I think the government should clarify it so that we can balance the power of police and organising a democratic process.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Anna Suby.
Thank you, Ms. Young. I think you're doing really well. Thank you for coming in. Just a quick question. I think I probably know the answer. Can I assume that your concerns about face coverings would also apply to the use of live facial recognition technology for protests?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Seconds out. Ms. Young. No? Right. Gerrard.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate this isn't a debate between elected members, but I'm not entirely sure from that exchange with the Minister and the witness where she got the idea that face coverings would only be banned if there's a suspicion of a crime. And there's a defence here for using face coverings to protect someone's health or religious observance. Maybe what the witness, Ms. Young, is looking for is another type of defence where someone believes they're under political threat, maybe from a government or organisation abroad. And that would be a fair defence for wanting to protect your identity. I wonder whether she might comment on that possibility.
Ms. Young?
Yes,
quite all right. Take your time.
Can I reword it to be helpful?
Yes.
I just see in the bill that there is a defence to allow people to wear a face covering. One of the examples is if it is for their health. So I imagine there might be a health reason why someone might need to wear a mask. And there is another example of if it's connected to a religious belief that someone might have a face covering and that they shouldn't have to remove it in a protest. I wonder if there was a third defence, not that I'm advocating for it, but I'm suggesting it, whereby someone has a defence because they say they are under threat from a foreign government or organisation. They fear for their personal safety. Whether that might satisfy your concern for example, people from Hong Kong, but also other places.
Yes, I think this is a very proportionate measure or defence to add to the bill. This would definitely safeguard communities for their fear of being spied on by their peers or state-aligned actors like, for example, state-aligned Chinese international students who violently attacked Hong Kong protester in a Southampton protest in 2023.
Ms. Young, I suspect that there are probably a number of things that you wish to say to the committee that you haven't really had the opportunity to express. Please feel free to write to the committee through the Secretariat, and your views will be given the proper attention.
Right.
So feel free to set any other comments that you have in writing. I suspect it may have taken you a fairly considerable amount of courage to come here this afternoon. We really are most grateful.
Thank you. I just want to add another point here before I finish. So, for many of these people, for many of the members of my community, I think this is really important to strike a balance because this is also a form of, these protests are not just a way for them to express their dissenting voices, but also part of the identity, part of the community cohesion. It's also the reason why over 200,000 Hong Kongers are now in the UK. Is this the reason why they're here? So I hope the committee to take account of this factor when they're considering this bill and to view these causes in that lens. Thank you.
Much indeed. Thank you. Next witnesses, please.
Gosh, it is a long way away down there.
It's far. Yeah, it's far away.
Order. We shall now hear oral evidence from the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice Ministers. We have until 5:50 p.m. for this panel. And starting with the Police Minister, could we ask you to introduce yourselves briefly for the record?
I'm Diana Johnson. I'm the Policing, Fire and Crime Minister.
Alex Davis-Jones. I'm the Victims and Violence Against Women and Girls Minister.
Shadow Minister?
On fly tippings, we've heard lots of comment on fly tipping. We know it comes a huge cost to the taxpayer and to local authorities. The measures here in talk about guidance, aren't they, effectively? The last government increased fines and penalties for these things. If the guidance can, maximise the impact that local authorities can have and their understanding of what they can do, that's great. But could you give us a flavour of what that guidance might look like, how effective we think it would be, and whether the government would be prepared to engage with or consider suggested improvements in this area during the course of the bill?
Well, thank you for the question, and having heard the evidence this afternoon and this morning as well, I think I'm quite happy to reflect on what's been said, clearly setting out the statutory guidance that will be made available will help provide that consistency of approach, because I think one of the points that was made was the inconsistent way that fly tipping is being dealt with, and also perhaps not all local authorities are dealing with or using all the powers that they actually have. So I do think there is merit in having that statutory guidance set out, but I'm very willing to look at what other proposals might come forward.
And then on retail crime, obviously the last bill, the big difference, I was delighted to see that the assault on retail workers offence is coming forwards. But in terms of the last bill, the criminal justice bill, put in place a mandatory requirement for a ban, a tag or a curfew after 3 instances of shoplifting or assaults on retail workers. What's the rationale behind ditching? Now, obviously, we've all heard the horrors that some retail workers face, and the idea of a ban or a tag or a curfew allowing that bit of respite for people, getting these people out of those stores and letting people get on with their jobs.
Well, I think it's fair to say that there is the power already available to courts when they convict on shop theft and hopefully now on assaults on shop workers, to use the full range of, which can include, of course, tagging, community services, a whole range of things. And, of course, with the assault on a retail worker, we are making a specific presumption that a criminal behaviour order should be attached to that. But I don't think that we're in any way saying that it may not be appropriate to use a tag. What I've also been told is that a lot of the prolific shop lifters, the people who are committing these offences, are often people where they've got chaotic lifestyles, and actually tags are not always going to be the most effective way of dealing with them. So that's something to be mindful of when you're saying that has to be a part of the punishment. It may not be, and that's really why the court should use its discretion to apply whatever sanction is most appropriate for that individual.
And then on dispersal orders and public space technology, we know they're hugely valued. We know that they can have a big impact in controlling antisocial behaviour, etc. The previous bill liberalised their use. It allowed, they made them more accessible to police officers, to local authorities. What is the rationale? Why would we want to remove some of that freedom for police officers and local authorities to put them to easier use?
Sorry, I think with the dispersal orders, we've taken the view that this is a power that should be given to the police and kept with the police. We don't think it should be used by local authorities. We think it's a serious power to, and I think we're also saying that it's going up in terms of the number of hours that it can be used for as well. So we think it's best suited to the police to make those types of decisions.
And then last but not least, you might notice I'm a bit of a hobby horse with off-road bikes because it's an absolute nightmare in my part of the world, as it is in many other parts of the world. It's epidemic, largely non-legal bikes, non-road legal bikes being used by the youngsters to commit antisocial behaviour or enabling crime. We've mentioned briefly today the fact that there are several powers the police have available to them to use. We're slightly editing one of them. The Section 59 of the Road Traffic Act. We've talked about the Police Reform Act that you're amending to allow people to not be given notice. Will the government be willing to look a bit further in this space at what more we could do, particularly around allowing the police access to private dwellings particularly about what happens to these bikes when they are seized by the police, and any measures that could limit the sale of these bikes and reduce the number that are getting onto the
It's
streets.
very disconcerting when you keep lighting up and then we keep plunging into darkness. So apologies if I can't quite remember everything you said there. But certainly we think that what we're introducing to get rid of the warning requirement is important. And I think probably all members of this committee will know of how it blights communities when you have this antisocial behaviour use of vehicles, whether it's motorbikes, mini-motos, e-scooters, it blights communities. So we think this is a really important tool that the police will be able to have to seize those vehicles without having to give the warnings, because we know that frustrates the police and it frustrates communities. But certainly other measures, I'm certainly prepared to look at other measures as well, but we think that this would be very impactful to introduce removing the warning.
And just one last question on that, actually. Obviously, as we mentioned, there are several powers in several pieces of legislation that allow people to do it, sometimes with notice, sometimes without, sometimes based on having insurance or not having insurance, and where they can seize those bikes from. I'm right in thinking there is no numbers held nationally of which of those powers are being used to seize these bikes by which police forces. We don't have any awareness of that, and therefore couldn't really decide how effective the measure would be.
Well, I think one of the frustrations I've found since becoming the Minister for Policing is that data isn't held centrally. We do have problems with data because of the changes that were introduced during the coalition years, actually, to devolve everything down to police forces, the 43 police forces. They often measure things in slightly different ways. So one of the measures we're going to be bringing is to try and bring up to the Home Office clear data so we can see what is going on these types of matters which really are of concern to communities. We want to make sure we've got accurate data. So I think you're probably right that we don't have accurate data, and I think probably police forces are using different ways of categorising the antisocial behaviour through vehicles. So I take your point on that, and I think there's work to do.
I'm conscious of the fact that most of these questions are in fact the responsibility of the police minister, but is there anything that you wish to add?
Nothing on this part, Sir Roger. I'm happy to come in on the measures that the MOJ has.
I just didn't want you to not have the chance.
No, it's fine.
Right, Mr. Barnes-Sampson.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger. My question is for Minister Davies-Jones. And I declare my interest being on the Women and Equality Select Committee, because this very much relates to our work on that. So I have a big interest in the government's mission to halve violence against women and girls. And could you outline to us what measures in this bill will help meet that goal and how?
Yes, thank you for that question. We see this bill as a key tool in our arsenal in achieving our ambition of halving violence against women and girls over the course of a decade. This bill has a number of measures and new offences that we are creating which we think will go some way to achieving that mission, be it strengthening stalking protection orders, clarifying the law around spiking, tackling the issue of taking intimate images without consent, there's new laws on child sexual abuse material, which we've heard previously as well. So there are a number of new offences within this bill that will go towards achieving our mission, and this will sit nicely alongside the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which the government will be publishing later this year.
Thank you.
Anna Sabine.
Chair, goes on nicely because yes, the bill does create lots of new offences and orders, but one of the themes of today has been around resourcing, and I wondered to what extent the government has actually looked at the impact this is going to have on the police, the courts, and local authorities.
All of the impact assessments have been published on gov.uk outlining this. That has been done. Obviously, I think members will be well aware of the crisis that we have inherited in the criminal justice system, be that within the court system or the prison system at the moment. However, we feel it necessary to make sure that there is always a prison place available for those who require a prison place for public protection and for punishment. And that is why we have brought this bill forward today, whilst recognising that within the criminal justice system we also have a number of reviews that are taking place independently, be it the sentencing review and the review into our courts as well.
And can I just add in that we had the police settlement at the end of January. We listened to what policing was saying, particularly around our commitment around neighbourhood policing and the 13,000 additional police officers and PCSOs during the course of this Parliament. So we doubled the amount of money going in to kickstart that from April, from 100 million to 200 million. overall the police settlement has gone up by, I think it's 1.2 billion. So additional money is going in, but I agree with what the PCC said about the challenging circumstances that some forces are in. We recognise that, and there is a proposal, a white paper coming forward on police reform, because we think we can do things more efficiently and effectively as we go forward. And certainly there is work now around the efficiencies that we can get out of the policing budget in terms of things like buying fleet, if we do it together rather than individual police forces, IT together rather than individual 43 police forces. So there are savings to be made there, which we want to plough back into police funding.
I wonder if I could have a quick second question. No.
Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Roger. Minister Johnson, I just wonder if you could briefly explain the government's rationale and thinking in not making it a criminal offence for a person in regulated activity to fail to report child sexual abuse.
So I think we heard witnesses today who talked about this, and we're very conscious that within regulated activity, that doesn't just include the people you would expect, perhaps social workers or teachers, but it can include, for example, taxi drivers who are taking children to school on the taxi run in the morning. It can include volunteers who run the football club on a Saturday. It can include all sorts of people who volunteer their time to help out and to work with young people and give back to their community. We were very conscious that I think the recommendations out of Alexis Jay's inquiry were not about criminalising those individuals. We want to make sure, of course, that individuals report into local authorities and to the police when they hear really disturbing things from children and young people about sexual abuse. Of course we do. But we didn't think it was appropriate to criminalise it that way. But what we were very clear about, and again I think Alexis Jay's inquiry makes this point, that anybody who tries to interfere or stop that reporting, that's the criminal offence there. That's the bit that we think is important, that it's in the bill. But I'm sure Alex has probably got something else to say on that.
I just wanted to briefly come in to counteract some of the evidence we received from Councillor Garrett earlier today. He was incorrect. There are sanctions in the bill, yes, professional sanctions for those who fail to report. And it does also cover anyone working voluntary or professionally with children in a religious setting. So I just wanted to put that on the record.
And of course, I think that's absolutely right. So, you know, if you're a social worker and you do not report into the local authority or to the police, then there will be repercussions through your regulatory body and also through the DBS as well, the Disclosure and Barring Service. So that there are repercussions, yes.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Sir Roger, and thank you both. Firstly, on retail crime, we heard in panel 4 that in Scotland, delivery drivers are included in abuse, etc., of retail workers. What work was done alongside the Scottish Act, or looking at Scotland, to get to the decision that they wouldn't be included in this bill here? And then secondly, on the respect orders, when we've been discussing reducing the age from 18, why was 18 chosen? And on the evidence we've had today or other, would there be consideration of reducing the age given where most or a lot of antisocial behaviour is coming from?
So I think to the point on the antisocial behaviour and why respect orders are 18 and above is because we are really clear that we do not want to criminalise young people. We don't think it's appropriate to take the age down to 16. Of course, there are civil injunctions already in place to deal with young people under 18 who are engaging in antisocial behaviour. They will carry on. I think they're going to be called youth injunctions, so they will carry on. We're also committed to the prevention partnerships, which means identifying those young people who are getting themselves into difficulty, antisocial behaviour or other criminal activity, and trying to work with them early on. I think keeping young people and children out of the criminal system as much as we can and diverting them is key to this, and that's why the respect order is post-18. And on the retail crime, that was a manifesto promise in the Labour manifesto last summer that we were going to introduce this particular measure, and that was specifically around the fact that some retail workers are carrying out a public service duty in terms of sales of alcohol. They have to check the age of the individual, and in many other instances as well, knives, sales of knives, you have to check. So that's why we wanted to have a specific offence dealing with retail workers carrying out that particular role.
So with respect, but a delivery driver would be delivering such products as well?
Well, what we've said is that we are very conscious as well that we want to look at, again, this goes back to poor data, because at the moment assaults on retail workers are treated just as assaults, they're not separated out. We are very keen to get the data to see what is actually happening with retail workers. I'm very happy to look at suggestions that the committee might have, but our proposal at the moment is to be very clear. We want to bring this particular measure in for assaults on retail workers because of what I've just described, that public service duty that they have. But I did hear the evidence earlier on, and I heard what was said about Scotland as well. I'm very happy to consider that and to look at it.
Alex Barris-Curtis.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Just following on from that point in terms of the assault on a retail worker, as Minister Davis-Jones, you've said, and we heard evidence about the equivalent with the emergency worker assault when that was introduced. And when I used to sit on the Justice Select Committee, because of the shocking court backlog, one of the inheritances of the last government, the actual prosecution of that and getting through to a conviction at the Crown Court was very, very slim. So what cross-governmental working will the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice and so on be doing in order to really try and tackle that so that the equivalent doesn't happen here with the assault on a retail worker? And then just quickly on police accountability, we've had some very kind of public examples of PCCs and chief constables falling out, and the kind of fallout which affects confidence in policing and has a pecuniary impact on the taxpayers. So what confidence do you, particularly Minister Johnson, have in that these measures will not help sort of cement that, but actually will help restore and ensure that there is adequate confidence in our policing? It doesn't lead to further fracturing in that relationship.
On the court's point, should I take that point first? Yeah, of course. Conversations have been happening incredibly closely, hence why we've got two departments represented on the bill in terms of the court impact from this. As I said, all of the impact assessments have been published on the gov.uk website, but we've also taken measures we have in order to free up capacity in the Crown Court system at the moment by allowing magistrates bigger sentencing powers. We have got also the independent review being done by Sir Brian Levison to look at what else steps we could take in order to address the issue within our court system. But we've also funded in the next financial year the Crown Courts to sit to their highest ever capacity in terms of what we can give as a department in terms of making sure that the court sitting days that are available, we fund them to the highest level that they ever have been.
And on your point around PCCs and chief constables and restoring confidence in the police, one of the reasons why we have a white paper coming down the track later in the spring is because we do need to do some work around the relationships between PCCs and chief constables. We think that that there is work to do there. We also think there is still more work to do around vetting. We said as one of our manifesto commitments that we would bring in mandatory vetting standards for police officers for when they come into the police forces. So there's a whole range of things we need to do alongside the restoring of police officers in all our communities. So we've got those 13,000 officers in our high streets and villages and communities because, again, that visible presence is how you start to restore that confidence generally.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Roger.
Joe Robson, a 15-second question and a 15-second answer.
If I may, Minister, there appears to be a loophole from the evidence we've heard today on the spiking in that somebody has to intend to annoy, but we've heard there can be reckless activity around a prank. Will she go away and consider whether gross negligence around pranking could be captured under that spiking law?
I heard that evidence, as did the officials, and we have clarified that under the current legislation, pranking would be covered and is explicit covered from
invite her
as well.
to look at the wording, explore the wording, because I'm not convinced on the wording. But thank you.
Order.